The police burst into my bedroom at exactly 2:05 in the morning, and I had absolutely no idea why. My neighbors watched in stunned silence as officers dragged me out of my own home in handcuffs. My wife stood in the driveway, recording the entire humiliating spectacle on her phone, weeping for the camera. At the station, a hardened detective tossed a thick file onto the metal table, ready to put me away for good. He read the first 2 lines and suddenly stood up straight. He looked at the patrol officers and said, "Remove the cuffs right now." Then he turned to me, completely pale, and asked a question that would change everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who severely underestimated your worth. My name is Philip Reed. I am 70 years old, and for the last 15 years, I believed I was sharing my life with a woman who loved me. That illusion was violently shattered on a humid Tuesday night in our quiet Ohio suburb. The sound was deafening, a massive crash of splintering wood and shattering glass that jolted me from a deep sleep. Before my eyes could even adjust to the darkness, blinding flashlight beams pierced the shadows of my bedroom. Loud voices were screaming conflicting orders. "Hands, grab the covers, get your hands where I can see them." I was violently yanked from my mattress. The cold, unforgiving floor rushed up to meet my face. A heavy knee pressed into my lower back, forcing the breath from my lungs. I felt cold steel ratcheting tightly around my wrists, pinching my skin. I am a retired logistics manager, a man who has lived a quiet, lawful life, and yet I was being handled like a violent fugitive. As they hauled me to my feet, my joints aching in protest, my first thought was of my wife Diane. I frantically searched the chaotic room for her, terrified that she was in danger, terrified that this was a home invasion. But Diane was not in the bed. Diane was not cowering in the corner. Diane was already outside. The officers marched me down the hallway, my bare feet stumbling over the hardwood floors I had paid to install. As they pushed me through the shattered remnants of our front door, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers illuminated our manicured front lawn. And there she was. Diane, my wife of 15 years, was standing under the amber glow of the porch light. She was not terrified. She was holding her smartphone up the screen, glowing brightly in the dark, live streaming the entire ordeal. Oh, she was putting on a magnificent performance. Tears streamed down her cheeks, catching the glare of the police lights. She held her free hand over her mouth, playing the part of the devastated, broken-hearted spouse to absolute perfection. I could hear her voice cracking as she spoke to her digital audience, yelling over the noise. "I could not hide your crimes anymore, Philip. I had to protect my family. I had to do the right thing." The sheer audacity of her lies hit me harder than the pavement had. Standing just a few feet behind her in the shadows of the driveway were her son Justin and his wife Monica. They were not crying. They were not screaming. They stood shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed with identical self-satisfied smirks plastered across their faces. Justin, the boy. I had taken in the man I had mentored and installed as the vice president of my life's work. Reed Freight looked at me as if I were a piece of garbage being taken to the curb. Monica leaned into him, whispering something in his ear that made him chuckle. They were basking in my public humiliation. I was shoved into the back of a squad car. The hard plastic seat offered no comfort to my aching back. The doors slammed shut, sealing me inside a cage of thick glass and metal. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb, I watched through the wire mesh of the window. Neighborhood porch lights were flicking on one by one. Curtains were twitching. People I had known for a decade were stepping out onto their lawns in their bathrobes, watching the quiet 70-year-old Philip Reed being carted away like a common criminal. The ride to the station was a blur of flashing lights and suffocating silence. I sat in the darkness, feeling the tight pinch of the handcuffs digging into my wrists. I knew exactly what was happening. I knew this was Diane's final, desperate attempt to destroy me completely. She could not wait. She was too arrogant, too impatient to let her original trap run its course. She wanted me humiliated locally. She wanted my reputation burned to the ground before the sun even came up. She had planted the stolen company hard drives in my personal safe and made a tearful, panicked call to the authorities claiming she had just uncovered my massive corporate fraud. She had handed them a prepackaged narrative complete with forged documents designed to frame me for the very embezzlement she and her son were committing. The police station smelled of stale coffee, cheap floor wax, and misery. It was cold, the kind of institutional chill that seeps right into your bones. They marched me through a maze of fluorescent-lit hallways, ignoring my requests for an explanation, ignoring the fact that a man my age should not be shoved around in his pajamas. They threw me into an interrogation room. It was exactly like the ones you see on television. Windowless with concrete block walls, a heavy metal table bolted to the floor, and a mirror that I knew was a two-way glass. They chained my handcuffs to a steel ring on the table, leaving me hunched forward in an uncomfortable metal chair. I sat there for what felt like hours. The silence was designed to break you, to make your mind race with panic and fear. But I was not panicking. I was simply waiting. Finally, the heavy door clicked open. A man walked in, followed by two uniformed patrol officers who stood by the door like stone gargoyles. The man wore a rumpled suit and a face lined with exhaustion and cynicism. He carried a massive, thick manila folder under his arm. He dropped the folder onto the metal table with a loud, aggressive thud and pulled out the chair across from me. He leaned in, placing his hands flat on the table, sizing me up with a look of pure disgust. "Mr. Reed," he began, his voice a low, threatening gravel. "I am Detective Larson. You have been a busy man, have you not? It is always the quiet, respectable ones. The guys who mow their lawns on Sundays and steal millions from behind a desk on Mondays." I did not say a word. I just looked at him, maintaining a steady, calm expression. My silence seemed to irritate him further. He tapped the thick file with his index finger. "Your wife came to us, Mr. Reed. She was terrified. She handed us the keys to your little kingdom. She gave us the hard drives you kept hidden in your safe, the forged tax documents, the transfer logs. We have the whole story right here in this file. The story of how you bankrupted your own company and siphoned the money into shell accounts. You are looking at the rest of your natural life behind bars." Still, I said nothing. I knew exactly what was in that file, and I knew exactly what was not in that file. Detective Larson sneered, clearly annoyed by my lack of a reaction. "Let us go through the highlights, shall we?" He flipped open the cover of the thick manila folder, preparing to read Diane's fabricated evidence out loud, ready to nail me to the wall with my wife's lies. Larson's eyes scanned the first page. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. I watched his eyes narrow in confusion. He blinked, bringing the page closer to his face. He read the first few lines again. The arrogant sneer slowly melted away from his features, replaced by a look of profound, absolute shock. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. His hands, which had been so steady and intimidating just seconds before, began to tremble slightly. He hastily flipped to the second page. His eyes darted back and forth across the text, reading as fast as he could. Then he flipped to the third page. He swallowed hard. The silence in the interrogation room stretched out, becoming thick and suffocating. The two patrol officers by the door shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden drastic change in the atmosphere. Detective Larson closed the file slowly. He did not look at me with disgust anymore. He looked at me with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. He stood up straight, clearing his throat awkwardly. He turned to the two massive patrol officers standing guard. "Remove his cuffs." Larson ordered, his voice tight and completely devoid of its earlier bravado. The officers exchanged a confused look. "Sir, the suspect is a flight risk. I said remove the cuffs right now." Larson barked, his voice echoing sharply off the concrete walls. The officers did not argue this time. One of them stepped forward, produced a small key, and unlocked the heavy steel bracelets. I rubbed my raw red wrists, bringing my hands down to rest comfortably on the metal table. Detective Larson dismissed the patrol officers with a sharp nod. "Get out." Close the door behind you. Do not let anyone interrupt us. The officers scrambled out of the room, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind them. We were alone. Larson stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed file on the table, as if it were a live explosive. He finally looked up, meeting my eyes with a newfound, staggering level of respect. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper, "the Federal Bureau has been waiting for your signal. Is it time to execute the warrants on your wife?" I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension of the last 6 months finally begin to release its grip on my chest. I looked directly at the camera, addressing you, the audience. To understand how my wife managed to orchestrate her own federal takedown, and how I turned a 2 a.m. police raid into the final nail in my family's coffin. We need to rewind the clock 6 months. 6 months ago, my house was not a war zone. It was a mausoleum. I was a ghost haunting my own life, walking through hallways. I paid for sleeping in a bed that felt colder every single night. At 70 years old, you start to notice how people look at you, or rather, how they stop looking at you. You become invisible. You become a piece of old furniture that everyone has to awkwardly walk around. Diane perfected the art of making me feel obsolete. We had been married for 15 years, and somewhere along the line, her affection curdled into a suffocating, toxic pity. It started with small things. I would be reading the morning paper at the kitchen table, and she would snatch my coffee mug away before I was finished, telling me caffeine was bad for my heart. She began repeating herself when she spoke to me, talking slowly, loudly, as if I had suddenly forgotten the English language. "Philip, did you hear me?" she would say, her voice dripping with artificial patience. "You need to wear a sweater outside. You know how confused you get when you catch a chill." I was not confused. I never got confused. But I let it slide. I loved peace more than I loved being right. I thought staying quiet was the price of maintaining a happy home in my twilight years. That was my first mistake. My silence was not interpreted as patience. It was interpreted as weakness. And weakness in my house was an invitation for predators. The primary predator was Justin. Diane had brought him into our marriage when he was in his early 20s. He was a boy with no direction, no ambition, and a chip on his shoulder the size of Ohio. I gave him a job at the bottom of my company, Reed Freight. Over the years, I personally mentored him. I paid off his early credit card debts. I taught him the logistics business from the ground up. When I decided to step back from the daily grind and transition into a quiet retirement, I made Justin the vice president. I handed him the keys to my kingdom, thinking I was securing a legacy for our family. Instead, I handed him a weapon. Justin moved through my house and my company with the swagger of a prince who had already been crowned king. His wife, Monica, was just as bad. She was a woman who looked at everything I owned and mentally calculated its resale value. They came over for dinner every Sunday. Those dinners were an exercise in psychological endurance. Justin would sit at the head of my table, a seat I had quietly surrendered to avoid Diane complaining, and he would talk about my company as if I had never existed. He would brag about new contracts and efficiency metrics, completely ignoring the fact that I had built the infrastructure he was boasting about. If I ever tried to interject, offering a piece of advice or asking a question about the supply chain, Justin would let out a loud, theatrical sigh. Monica would roll her eyes and look at her phone. Then Justin would smile, a condescending, tight-lipped smile, and say, "Dad, the industry has changed. We do not do things the old-fashioned way anymore. You just focus on enjoying your retirement. Do not stress your brain with the complicated stuff." Diane would immediately chime in, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. "Justin is right, Philip. You get so worked up when you try to understand the new software. Just eat your mashed potatoes, sweetheart." I chewed my food in silence. I swallowed my pride along with it. I told myself that this was just the arrogance of youth. I told myself that my legacy was safe even if the boy running it was an ungrateful fool. I was tired. I had worked 60-hour weeks for 4 decades. I just wanted to read my books, fish on the weekends, and live out my days without conflict. I accepted their disrespect because confronting it meant tearing my family apart. I chose to be the invisible man, but an invisible man sees everything, and what I started to see made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was a rainy Thursday evening. Diane had gone to some charity gala with Monica, leaving me alone in the house. Justin was supposedly at the office working late. I was sitting in my leather armchair in my study, listening to the rain hit the glass. I decided to log into the company portal. Even though I was retired, I still held the title of founder and primary shareholder. Every quarter, I liked to pull up the master financial reports just to keep a pulse on the health of Reed Freight. It was a harmless habit, a way to stay connected to the empire I had built. I opened my laptop. I navigated to the secure company server. I typed in my credentials. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the muscle memory of a man who had done this 10,000 times before. I clicked on the directory for the latest quarterly financial reports. A gray box popped up on my screen. Access denied. I frowned. I assumed it was a simple typo. At my age, it is easy to hit the wrong key. I carefully re-entered my password, making sure every letter and number was perfectly correct. I hit enter again. Access denied. Contact your network administrator. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I navigated to the general employee directory. I could access that. I could see the holiday schedules, the human resources forms, the basic operational updates. But when I tried to open the accounts payable folder, the master ledger, or any document dealing with liquid capital, the same gray box slapped me in the face. Access denied. This was not a glitch. This was a deliberate targeted firewall. Someone had gone into the system architecture and specifically revoked the security clearances for my user profile. There was only one person at Reed Freight who had the administrative authority to alter the founder permissions. Justin. I sat back in the heavy leather chair. The sound of the rain outside suddenly seemed very far away. Why would my stepson intentionally lock the majority shareholder out of the financial records? If the company was doing as well as he claimed at Sunday dinners, he should be practically shoving those reports in my face to prove how smart he was. You do not put a padlock on a door unless there is something behind it you are desperate to hide. I closed the laptop. The silence in my study felt entirely different now. It was no longer the peaceful silence of a well-earned retirement. It was the tense, heavy silence of a battlefield just before the first shot is fired. I had spent 6 months playing the role of the fading, senile nuisance to keep the peace. I had let them treat me like a fool. But what my arrogant stepson and my cruel wife completely forgot was the man I used to be before I ever shipped a single freight container. I was not just an old man who got lucky in business. I was a man who knew exactly how to find secrets buried in the dark. And I was about to find theirs. I sat in the dim light of my study staring at those 2 gray words on my screen. Access denied. To an ordinary 70-year-old man, that message might be a signal to give up, to call the help desk in the morning, to accept that technology had finally passed him by. Justin was banking on that exact reaction. He was banking on my supposed exhaustion. He thought I was just an old logistics guy who got lucky moving shipping containers from point A to point B. He thought my entire world revolved around delivery trucks and warehouse schedules. Justin was a fool. He only saw the empire I had built. He never bothered to learn the history of the man who built it. Before I ever bought my first freight truck, before I ever worried about supply chains or shipping manifests, I spent 15 years in a very different line of work. I spent my 30s and early 40s as a forensic accountant for a ruthless corporate auditing firm in Chicago. My entire job consisted of walking into massive companies and finding the money that corrupt executives tried to hide. I hunted financial ghosts for a living. I tracked offshore accounts, shell companies, and manipulated ledgers. I knew how thieves thought because I spent thousands of hours dismantling their lies brick by digital brick. Forensic accounting is not just about math. It is about human behavior. When someone is stealing, they get paranoid. They build walls. They create diversions. They think they are being incredibly clever by layering passwords and encrypting files. But every lock leaves a trace and every wall has a weak point. I knew how to find those weak points because I used to be the guy who got called in when the police hit a dead end. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath, letting the familiar thrill of the hunt wash over me. I felt my posture change. The tired, hunched old man that Diane loved to mock melted away in the shadows of the study. My mind felt sharper than it had in months. The fog of forced retirement lifted completely. I walked over to the heavy oak bookshelf in the corner of the room. I reached behind the bottom row of thick encyclopedias and pressed a hidden latch. A small false panel popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a sleek encrypted flash drive that I had not touched in years. When I transitioned my company to a modern digital network 5 years ago, I let Justin bring in his fancy tech consultants. They built a massive cloud-based architecture filled with firewalls and security protocols. Justin strutted around the office, bragging about how impenetrable the new system was. He told me not to worry my old head about it. But what Justin did not know was that I never hand over the keys to my house without keeping a master copy for myself. Before the new network went live, I quietly instructed my lead developer, a loyal friend who had been with me since day one, to install a deep structural backdoor into the mainframe. It was an invisible entry point, hard-coded into the foundation of the system. It bypassed every user interface and every administrative block. It was my digital skeleton key. I sat back down at my desk and plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The screen flickered, turning a deep solid black before a command prompt terminal appeared. The rain continued to beat against my study window, a steady rhythmic drumming that matched the beating of my heart. I began to type. I did not need a mouse. I did not need a flashy user interface. I used raw code, bypassing the colorful login screens that Justin was so proud of. My fingers danced across the keys, waking up muscles and instincts I thought I had buried long ago. I watched lines of data scroll rapidly down the screen. I was entering the system not through the front door, but through the foundation. The firewall tried to challenge me, triggering an automated security check. I countered it with the override sequence stored on my drive. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second, trying to reconcile the conflicting commands. Then, with a satisfying silent submission, the black screen cleared. The master directory of Reed Freight opened before my eyes. I was in. I had successfully bypassed every single digital lock my arrogant stepson had put in place. I felt a brief surge of victory, but it vanished almost instantly. As a forensic accountant, you learn that the real story is never just in the files themselves. The real story is in the access logs. I navigated straight to the administrative dashboard. I did not want to look at the money yet. I wanted to look at the locks. I wanted to see exactly how and when I was shut out. I pulled up the security history for my personal user profile. What I saw made the blood run cold in my veins. This was not a simple clerical error. It was not a glitch caused by a software update. The logs showed a meticulous surgical isolation of my account. Justin had logged in using his executive credentials 3 weeks ago at 2 a.m. He had systematically stripped away my viewing permissions folder by folder. But he did not just lock me out of the financial records. The logs showed he had created a shadow protocol. He had programmed the system to feed my profile dummy reports. If I had simply requested a summary of the quarterly earnings, the system would have generated a completely fabricated document designed to look perfectly normal. He was actively managing my perception, creating a fake reality to keep me pacified. The precision of the betrayal was breathtaking. Justin was not just hiding something. He was actively erasing my presence from the company I had built with my own 2 hands. He was treating my life's work as his personal playground, and he was treating me as a threat that needed to be neutralized and contained. I stared at the glowing blue light of the monitor, feeling a terrifying calm settle over me. I had broken into the system. I had the access I needed to see exactly what he was hiding. But the true horror was staring back at me in those access logs. I was completely alone. The boy I had raised, the man I had trusted, was executing a hostile takeover right under my nose. And the digital walls he had built meant that whatever he was hiding in those financial records was far worse than simple mismanagement. The trap was set, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The house was entirely silent now. The heavy rain from earlier had faded into a slow, quiet drizzle. Upstairs, Diane was fast asleep, likely dreaming of whatever charity luncheon she had planned for tomorrow. I sat alone in the dim light of my study, staring at the raw data of my life's work. The master ledger of Reed Freight was open on my screen. It was an ocean of numbers, dates, and vendor codes. To anyone else, it would look like a meaningless wall of text. To me, it was a map. I just needed to find the path that Justin had tried to erase. When you hunt for stolen money, you never look for the big dramatic withdrawals. Thieves who steal millions in one lump sum usually get caught before they can even spend it. Smart thieves are patient. They act like parasites. They attach themselves to the veins of a healthy company and siphon off the blood one tiny drop at a time. They hide their theft in the most boring, unremarkable corners of the accounting department. I started my search in the accounts payable folder. I filtered the data to show only the last 12 months of activity. I bypassed the major shipping contracts and the fuel expenses. Those were too highly regulated, too closely monitored by our independent auditors. Instead, I focused on the miscellaneous operational costs. I looked for the vague categories: consulting fees, software licensing, independent logistical assessments. These were the dark corners where a clever thief could easily hide a fake invoice. My eyes scanned row after row of data. For the first hour, everything looked perfectly normal. I saw payments to our usual maintenance crews and our regular legal advisors. But my instincts kept me going. I knew Justin had locked me out for a reason. He had created a fake dashboard to feed me manipulated numbers. That meant the real numbers buried here in the master ledger held a secret he was desperate to protect. At 1:30 in the morning, I finally found the first loose thread. It was a payment record for a company called Apex Freight Solutions. The name sounded perfectly legitimate. It was exactly the kind of generic corporate title you would expect to see in a logistics database. The invoice was for $14,000, billed for a quarterly supply chain optimization review. I frowned. In my 40 years of running the company, I had never heard of Apex Freight Solutions. We already had an internal team dedicated to route optimization. We did not outsource that work. I cross-referenced the vendor code and pulled up every invoice associated with that company over the past year. There were 8 payments in total. All of them were for amounts just under $15,000. That specific number is a classic red flag in forensic accounting. It is small enough to fly under the radar of a mandatory financial review, but large enough to generate serious cash over time. I did not stop there. I used the billing pattern from Apex Freight Solutions to build a search query. I commanded the system to highlight any vendor that had been added to the ledger in the last 12 months, billing for vague consulting services in increments between $10,000 and $15,000. The screen blinked. When the new data loaded, my heart sank heavily into my chest. There was not just one fake vendor. There were 4. Apex Freight Solutions, Horizon Logistics Partners, Summit Operational Consulting, and Vanguard Freight Analytics. 4 completely fabricated companies bleeding my life's work dry. I highlighted the payment columns for all 4 vendors. I dragged the cursor down to the bottom of the screen and hit the sum function. The total calculated instantly: $400,000. I sat back in my chair and stared at that number. $400,000 was gone. It had been systematically drained from the operating budget over a single year. That money wasn't just a number on a screen. It was the profit margin that kept my drivers employed. It was the safety net for our warehouse staff. It was the legacy I had built through decades of missed holidays, early mornings, and late nights. Justin had not just stolen cash. He had stolen the security of the people who depended on me. A cold, hard anger settled over me. It was not the fiery, explosive anger of a betrayed father. It was the freezing, calculating anger of an auditor who had just found his target. I had the amount, and I had the method. Now I needed to know exactly where that money was going. I opened a secure browser and accessed the state corporate registry database. If I could pull the incorporation documents for these 4 vendors, I could find the names of the managing directors. I could find the exact bank accounts where my $400,000 had been deposited. I searched for Apex Freight Solutions first. The search results populated quickly. Yes, I had found the corporate registration. I eagerly clicked on the document to view the ownership details. But as the page loaded, the cold anger in my chest turned into a sickening knot of frustration. The company was registered as a limited liability corporation in the state of Wyoming. Wyoming is notorious in the financial world for its incredibly strict corporate secrecy laws. The state does not require LLCs to publicly disclose the names of their managers or members. The only name listed on the registration document was a generic registered agent service, a faceless third-party company that exists solely to receive legal mail on behalf of anonymous clients. I quickly searched the other 3 companies. It was the exact same story. 2 were registered in Wyoming, and 1 was registered in Delaware. All of them were shielded by anonymous registered agents. The ownership structures were heavily encrypted behind layers of legal privacy protections. There were no names. There were no addresses. There were no faces attached to the theft. I leaned forward, resting my head in my hands. The glow of the monitor cast long shadows across my silent study. I had successfully breached the ledger. I had found the missing $400,000. I knew the money was being funneled out of my company through dummy corporations. But Justin had been meticulously careful. He had built a fortress of legal paperwork around the stolen funds. The money was gone, and the identity of the thief was completely hidden behind an impenetrable wall of corporate anonymity. I had the evidence of the crime, but I was entirely locked out of proving exactly who was holding the cash. The corporate walls of Wyoming and Delaware are designed to be impenetrable. When a clever thief uses anonymous registered agents, they are counting on the investigator hitting a brick wall and giving up. But in forensic accounting, you learn very quickly that you do not need to knock down the wall. You just need to follow the plumbing. An anonymous company still needs a very real bank account to receive its stolen money. And banks, unlike shell companies, are heavily regulated and leave massive digital footprints. I opened the vendor profiles for the 4 fake companies in my billing system. Justin had been incredibly smart to hide the ownership documentation, but he was arrogant enough to be lazy with the daily operations. To get paid every month, he had to link a routing number to the automated payment portal. I pulled the banking details for Apex Freight Solutions and Horizon Logistics Partners. The routing numbers did not point to some shadowy offshore bank. They pointed to a regional credit union right here in Ohio. I stared at the name of the credit union on my screen. It was the exact same branch where Monica used to work as a teller before she married my stepson. The coincidence was too loud to ignore. It was a loose thread hanging from their perfect crime, and I pulled it with everything I had. I needed to connect the fake companies directly to them without relying entirely on the banking data. I moved away from the financial ledger and accessed the document repository. Every time a fake invoice was submitted for payment, someone had to physically upload a digital file into the system. And every digital file carries hidden information called metadata. Metadata records exactly when a document was created, how long it was edited, and most importantly, the name of the computer that generated it. I downloaded the original invoice for Summit Operational Consulting. My heart beat a heavy, slow rhythm against my ribs as I opened the Properties tab of the document. I scrolled down to the author information. The document was not created by a professional logistics firm. The author profile was registered to a personal laptop. The computer name listed in the metadata was Monica Home Office. A sickening twist of betrayal churned in my gut. My daughter-in-law was sitting in my living room smiling at me over Sunday pot roast while going upstairs to her laptop to generate fake invoices. She was actively bleeding my life away while sleeping under a roof that I paid for. But Justin and Monica could not just steal $400,000 and pretend it vanished into thin air. The Internal Revenue Service expects a clean paper trail. If a company claims massive operational expenses, They have to provide the tax forms to back it up. I navigated deeper into the company network, hunting for the annual tax filing directory. I opened the secure folder containing our federal vendor tax forms. I found the documents generated for the 4 shell companies. Justin had filed the paperwork classifying the stolen money as legitimate independent contractor expenses. He was using the federal tax code to legitimize the theft. But as I scrolled to the bottom of the tax forms, my blood ran completely cold. There at the bottom of the document was the authorization signature. It was my signature. My personal electronic authorization stamp was sitting right there on the fraudulent federal paperwork. Justin had used his administrative access to copy my digital signature. He had stamped my name onto dozens of fake invoices and fraudulent federal tax forms. He was making it look like I was the one approving the payments to the shell companies. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They were not just draining my company dry so they could buy luxury cars and designer clothes. They were meticulously building a legal trap. When the company inevitably went bankrupt and the federal auditors came knocking to find out where the money went, they would find a perfectly documented paper trail, a trail that pointed directly to me. Justin and Monica were planning to take the money and leave me holding the bag for massive federal tax evasion. They were setting me up to spend my final years in a federal prison. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it was breathtaking. My own family was framing me for a felony so they could walk away rich and unbothered. The cold, calculated anger I had felt earlier evaporated. It was replaced by a burning, consuming fury. I wanted to slam my laptop shut. I wanted to march out of my study, climb the stairs, and kick their bedroom doors open. I wanted to drag them out of their beds and scream until my voice gave out. I wanted to look them in the eyes and demand to know how they could be so evil. I looked up at the ceiling of my study knowing my treacherous wife was sleeping peacefully just 1 floor above me. I knew Diane had to be involved. Justin would never execute a plan this massive without his mother providing the distraction. She was keeping me docile, keeping me confused and isolated while her son robbed me blind. I had the proof. I had the metadata showing Monica created the files. I had the routing numbers pointing to her bank. I had the forged tax documents proving Justin was framing me. I had everything I needed to confront them right now. I could wake them up, shove the laptop in their faces, and watch their smug, arrogant smiles shatter into absolute panic. But my old forensic accounting instincts flared to life, slamming the brakes on my fury. If I confronted them tonight, I would lose everything. Justin still held the master administrative keys to the company network. If I woke him up and tipped my hand, he would not fall to his knees and confess. He would simply panic and protect himself. He could lock his bedroom door, log into the server from his smartphone, and initiate a full system wipe before I could even dial the police. He would delete the fake invoices. He would erase the routing numbers and scrub the metadata. All the concrete proof I had just uncovered would vanish into thin air, and what would be left? Just a confused 70-year-old man making wild, impossible accusations about stolen money. Diane would play the victim perfectly. She would cry and tell the police that my mind was finally going. Justin would use my angry outburst as ultimate proof that I was suffering from severe dementia and needed to be institutionalized. By trying to win the battle tonight, I would hand them the victory for the entire war. I realized then that my anger was my biggest vulnerability. If I wanted to save my company, my freedom, and my legacy, I could not afford to be a betrayed father. I had to become a ghost. I had to swallow my rage and let them continue believing that they were the smartest people in the room. I had to let them keep digging their own graves while I quietly secured the perimeter. I carefully closed the tax documents, making absolutely sure not to alter a single digital timestamp. I backed out of the server, completely erasing the tracks of my unauthorized late-night access. I shut down the laptop and sat in the dark, silent study, listening to the faint sound of the wind outside. I had found the smoking gun, but I had to keep my mouth shut. The real game had just begun. The morning sun hit my face, and for a brief second, I forgot that my entire life was a lie. Then the memory of the forged tax documents crashed into my chest. I lay in bed listening to the sound of Diane moving around in the kitchen downstairs. For 15 years, the smell of her brewing coffee was my favorite part of the day. Now it just made me feel sick to my stomach. I had to go down there. I had to look at the woman who was helping her son frame me for a federal crime, and I had to smile. I threw off the covers and forced myself to stand. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. I needed to become the exact person they thought I was. I let my shoulders slump forward. I practiced softening my eyes, making them look a little glassy, a little unfocused. I shuffled my feet slightly as I walked down the hallway, practicing the gait of a man whose best days were far behind him. It is a terrifying thing to intentionally diminish yourself, but it was my only armor. I walked into the kitchen. Diane was wiping down the counter. "Good morning, Philip," she said without looking up. I did not respond immediately. I let a few seconds pass, creating a manufactured delay in my reaction time. Finally, I blinked and looked at her. "Good morning, my dear," I replied, keeping my voice soft and slightly raspy. I walked over to the cabinet to get a coffee mug. I opened the door, stared blankly at the neat rows of cups, and then closed it without taking one. I walked to the refrigerator, opened it, and placed my car keys right on the top shelf next to the milk. I closed the door and sat at the kitchen table, rubbing my temples. A few minutes later, Diane opened the refrigerator. She stopped. She reached in and pulled out my keys, holding them up by the ring. The metal jingled loudly in the quiet kitchen. "Philip, why are your car keys in the refrigerator?" she asked. Her tone was a masterclass in fake concern, masking a deep, bubbling satisfaction. I looked at the keys and widened my eyes. I put my hand to my forehead, letting my mouth drop open slightly in a perfect display of manufactured confusion. "I have no idea," I stammered. "I must have been looking for the cream and just set them down without thinking. My head feels so foggy this morning." Diane walked over and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. It was the same hand that had likely signed off on the transfer of my wealth. "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed. "You are just getting so forgetful lately. You really need to stop trying to handle so many things on your own. It is too much for your brain to process." I nodded slowly, looking down at my empty hands. "You are right," I murmured. "I am just so tired." She patted my back and turned away, hiding her smile, but I saw her reflection in the dark glass of the microwave oven. She was beaming. She thought she was winning. She thought my mind was finally eroding, just like she and Justin needed it to. Playing the fool is an exhausting performance. It requires a discipline that drains your soul. Later that afternoon, Justin and Monica came over for a visit. Justin drove up in a brand new sports car. It was a sleek, aggressive machine that I instantly realized was paid for by the sweat of my warehouse workers and the missing $400,000. He tossed the keys onto the kitchen counter with a loud clatter, practically strutting into my home. "Dad," Justin said, clapping me hard on the back. "You are looking a little pale today." "Everything all right?" I forced a weak smile. "Just getting old, Justin. The years catch up with you." He laughed, a sharp, booming sound that grated against my nerves. "Well, do not you worry about a thing. I have everything handled at the office. In fact, I brought some of the new logistics projection models. I thought you might want to look them over. It was a test." He was probing to see if I still had the mental capacity to challenge him. He placed a thick folder of complex spreadsheets on the coffee table. I picked up the folder and opened it. I stared at the numbers. As a forensic accountant, I could read those spreadsheets like a children's book. I could see exactly where he had inflated the projected operating costs to hide his future thefts. It took every ounce of my willpower not to throw the folder in his face and demand my money back. Instead, I let my hands tremble slightly. I squinted at the pages, bringing them close to my face and then pulling them away as if my eyes could not focus. I flipped through 3 pages and then closed the folder with a heavy, defeated sigh. "I cannot make sense of these new formats, Justin," I said, letting my voice crack just a little. "The numbers just jump around on the page. It gives me a terrible headache to even try to understand the new software you boys use." Justin exchanged a quick, triumphant look with Monica. Monica tried to hide her smirk behind her coffee cup. "Do not stress yourself out, Dad," Justin said, taking the folder gently from my hands. "That is why you put me in charge, right? You built the ship, but you need a younger captain to navigate these new digital waters. I will take care of the heavy lifting. You just focus on resting." I nodded, leaning back into the sofa, looking thoroughly defeated. "Thank you, Justin. I do not know what I would do without you." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but the trap was set. They felt completely safe. They believed I was a toothless, blind old dog, completely oblivious to the wolves circling my bed. And because they felt safe, they grew sloppy. Over the next few weeks, I used their false sense of security against them. While they thought I was napping in my study, I was building my case. I purchased a discreet secondary laptop with cash and kept it locked inside a hollowed-out book on my bottom shelf. I slowly, meticulously documented every single forged tax document and fake invoice I had found on the server. I took screenshots of the metadata linking the dummy corporations directly to Monica. I created an encrypted digital vault copying everything they had stolen and hiding it where they could never reach it. I was gathering hard, undeniable evidence. The plan was working perfectly. My performance had completely disarmed them. But playing the fool is a dangerous game. When you convince a predator that you are weak, they do not simply leave you alone. They attack. One evening, I was sitting in the dark on the back patio, supposedly dozing in my rocking chair. The sliding glass door to the kitchen was open just a crack to let the evening breeze in. Diane was standing by the kitchen island talking on her cell phone. She was speaking in a hushed, urgent whisper. She thought I was fast asleep outside. I stayed perfectly still, keeping my breathing slow and even listening to every word. "I am telling you, Justin, he is fading much faster than we anticipated," Diane whispered, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "Today he put his keys in the refrigerator. Yesterday he could not even read a simple spreadsheet." I heard the faint sound of Justin's voice vibrating through the phone speaker. Diane shook her head aggressively. "No, we cannot wait until the end of the fiscal year," Diane hissed. "You do not understand how fragile he is getting. If he has a total mental break and goes to a doctor before we finalize the conservatorship, the state might step in and freeze the assets to protect him. We will lose control of the sale." My heart hammered against my ribs. I had acted too well. I had convinced her that my mind was eroding so successfully that she was now terrified of a medical intervention she could not control. "Justin, we have to move to the final phase now," Diane commanded, her voice dripping with a cold, terrifying authority. "We cannot wait 6 months. Get the final batch of corporate paperwork ready by next week. We need to get him out of this house and into a facility by the end of the month before anyone else notices his decline. Do whatever you have to do to accelerate the timeline." She hung up the phone. I remained perfectly still in the shadows of the patio, looking up at the night sky. I had successfully fooled them into thinking I was helpless, but my flawless acting had just triggered a countdown. I had pushed Diane into a corner, and she had just drastically accelerated her timeline to destroy me. The trap I was building for them was not ready yet, and they were coming for me right now. The accelerated timeline meant I had to move faster than I had ever moved in my entire life. Diane and Justin were not going to wait for the fiscal year to end. They were preparing to strike immediately. If they managed to force me into a care facility, they would gain absolute physical and legal control over my existence. I could not fight a massive corporate and legal war without a war chest. I needed liquid capital, and I needed it right now. Fortunately, I am a man who understands the absolute necessity of a safety net. Before I ever met Diane, and long before I ever allowed Justin to step foot inside Reed Freight, I had established a private portfolio. It was a standalone account at a completely different financial institution. It held a substantial sum of clean, untainted capital from my early days as a highly paid forensic accountant. Diane knew the account existed, but she did not have signing authority over it. It was my fortress. My plan was simple and straightforward. I would walk into the bank, empty the account, and wire the entire balance into a newly established blind trust. From there, I could quietly fund my counteroffensive without my family tracking a single penny. The following morning, Diane left the house early for a luxury spa appointment. The moment her car turned the corner and disappeared down the street, I dropped the shuffling, confused old man routine. I stood up straight, put on a sharp, tailored suit, and drove myself to the bank. Walking through those heavy glass doors, I felt like my old self again. I was Philip Reed, the founder, the brilliant strategist, the man who built an empire from nothing. I sat down in the plush office of the branch manager, a man I had known and done business with for over a decade. He looked up from his desk, and his welcoming professional smile immediately faltered. He looked incredibly nervous. He looked at me not with the deep respect of a long-term wealthy client, but with a strange, uncomfortable pity. I ignored his odd demeanor and confidently asked him to initiate a wire transfer for the total balance of my private portfolio. I provided the routing numbers for my blind trust and sat back waiting for the familiar clacking sound of his keyboard. The manager typed for a moment. He stopped. He swallowed hard and looked closely at his computer screen. Then he looked back at me, his face entirely pale. "I am so sorry, Philip," he said, his voice tight and apologetic. "I cannot process this transfer. In fact, I cannot authorize any withdrawals from this account at all." I felt a cold, heavy drop in the pit of my stomach. I asked him what the problem was, assuming it was a simple fraud alert triggered by the massive size of the request. The manager shook his head slowly. He turned his large monitor slightly so I could see the screen for myself. There was a bold red banner flashing across my account profile. It read, "Legal hold active." The manager leaned forward, speaking in a hushed, sympathetic tone, as if he were delivering a terminal medical diagnosis. "Philip, we received a court order late yesterday afternoon. Your accounts have been temporarily frozen pending a judicial review. Your wife Diane filed an emergency petition for a financial and medical conservatorship." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Conservatorship. In the legal world, a conservatorship is the equivalent of a death sentence for a living person. The manager explained with painful gentleness that Diane had submitted sworn affidavits to a family court judge. She claimed I was suffering from rapid and severe cognitive decline. She claimed I was a profound danger to myself and my finances. She had even submitted a detailed log of my recent behaviors, including the staged incident with the car keys in the refrigerator and my sudden, supposed inability to read simple financial spreadsheets. My own flawless performance to keep them at bay had been expertly weaponized against me. The full weight of the trap slammed into me. Diane had gone to a judge and painted a tragic, compelling picture of a brilliant, wealthy man losing his mind. She argued that I was highly vulnerable to financial exploitation and that my assets needed to be frozen immediately to protect my estate from predators. The judge, acting on the abundance of caution standard in elder care cases, had granted a temporary injunction. He froze everything I owned until a formal competency hearing could take place. Diane had successfully locked the vault, and she had swallowed the only key. A massive, suffocating wave of panic crashed over me. I wanted to slam my fists on the manager desk. I wanted to shout that it was all a vicious, calculated lie. I wanted to tear the pristine office apart and demand access to the money I had earned with my own blood and sweat. But my old forensic mind kicked in, gripping my raw, rising emotions like a steel vice. I realized the brilliance of her strategy. If I lost my temper right now, if I started screaming about corporate conspiracies, stolen freight funds, and evil stepsons, I would be giving Diane exactly what she needed. The manager would immediately call security. The local police would arrive. They would see an agitated, paranoid 70-year-old man shouting about invisible enemies and fake tax documents. It would be the final indisputable proof that my mind was completely gone. Diane would win the permanent conservatorship by lunchtime, and I would be locked in a secure memory care facility by dinner. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath. I relaxed my tense shoulders and let my face soften into a mask of vulnerability. I looked at the manager with a perfectly calibrated expression of mild, sad confusion. "I understand," I murmured, keeping my voice low and thoroughly defeated. Diane is just worried about me. My memory has been slipping lately. Thank you for your time. I stood up slowly, deliberately, holding the edge of the mahogany desk for balance. I walked out of the bank with the slow, shuffling gait of a completely broken man. I did not look back. I let the bank employees watch the tragic spectacle of a fallen titan wandering out the door. When I reached my car, I sat behind the steering wheel and stared out through the windshield. The reality of my situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I was entirely and hopelessly trapped. Justin had locked me out of my life work and was actively framing me for a federal crime. Diane had locked me out of my personal wealth and was legally erasing my basic human autonomy. I had no access to my own money to fight them. I had no way to hire a conventional defense team because the court would immediately notify my conservator, meaning Diane would know my every move. If I went to a standard family lawyer, they would try to fight the conservatorship in open court. The moment Diane and Justin realized I was legally fighting back, Justin would panic. He would wipe the company servers totally clean. He would destroy the metadata, the routing numbers, and the forged tax documents. He would erase the concrete proof of his massive theft, and I would be left with absolutely nothing but a wild story. I could not fight this battle in the light of day. I could not use normal weapons, and I could not hire a normal attorney. I needed someone who operated entirely in the shadows. I needed a legal heavyweight who did not play by the polite, conventional rules of the justice system. I needed a man who understood how to dismantle a deadly trap from the inside out without making a single sound. I closed my eyes and thought of the only man ruthless enough to take this on. I needed Stuart Campbell. The drive to downtown Cleveland took 45 minutes. I spent every second of it making sure no one was following me. When you realize your own family is actively hunting you, paranoia becomes your co-pilot. I parked 3 blocks away from the address I had written down. I walked the rest of the way, blending in with the morning commuter traffic. I needed to see Stuart Campbell. Stuart was not the kind of lawyer you call when you want to amicably split assets in a polite divorce. He was the kind of lawyer you call when you realize your business partner is actively trying to poison your coffee. We had crossed paths 15 years ago during a particularly vicious corporate merger. I remembered him as a man who viewed the legal system not as a scale of justice but as a chessboard. He was ruthless, discreet, and incredibly expensive. He was exactly what I needed. I walked into his firm. It did not have the flashy glass walls or the towering modern atrium of the corporate giants Justin liked to hire. It was an old brick building, discreet and solid. Stuart's office was lined with dark wood and heavy leather. He was sitting behind a massive desk, looking exactly as I remembered him, sharp, completely unreadable, and entirely focused. "Philip Reed," he said, standing up to shake my hand. "I thought you retired to play golf and read history books. What brings a man like you to my office on a Tuesday morning?" I did not sit down immediately. I looked him in the eye. "Stuart, I am currently locked out of my own company. My wife has frozen my personal assets, and she has petitioned a judge for a permanent medical conservatorship, claiming I am suffering from severe, rapid-onset dementia." Stuart raised a single eyebrow. He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. "Have a seat, Philip. Let us unpack this bomb you just dropped." I spent the next hour laying out every detail. I told him about the subtle emotional abuse, the staged confusion, the fake invoices, the hidden routing numbers, and the forged tax documents. I told him about the sudden freeze on my personal portfolio. Stuart listened in absolute silence. He did not take notes. He just absorbed the information, analyzing the angles. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "They have executed a textbook pincer movement." "Philip," he said, his voice clinically detached. "Your wife controls the personal narrative, preventing you from funding a defense. Your stepson controls the corporate narrative, burying the theft. If we walk into family court to fight the conservatorship right now, your stepson will panic. He will initiate a remote wipe of the company servers, and the evidence of the $400,000 theft will vanish. You will be left looking like a paranoid old man shouting at shadows. That is exactly why I came to you, I replied, leaning forward. I need to break the conservatorship without triggering alarms at the company. I need to secure my autonomy in complete silence. Stuart nodded, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. The burden of proof in an emergency conservatorship hearing is surprisingly low, he explained. Diane just needed a sworn affidavit and a compelling story. But to make it permanent, she needs medical certification. She will try to force you to see a doctor of her choosing. A doctor she has already primed with her narrative of your decline. We are not going to let her control the medical narrative, Stuart continued. We are going to build a fortress around your cognitive baseline. But we cannot use your regular doctor. We need specialists whose credentials are so intimidating, a family court judge will not dare question them. Stuart made 3 phone calls. Within 48 hours, he had arranged for a comprehensive neurological and psychiatric evaluation. It was not done in a hospital where my family might track the insurance billing. It was done in the private, highly secure offices of a top-tier medical consulting firm that Stuart kept on retainer for high-net-worth clients. The evaluation was grueling. For 6 hours, I sat in a sterile room, subjected to a battery of cognitive tests by 2 separate specialists. They tested my short-term memory, my spatial reasoning, my executive function, and my problem-solving skills. They asked me complex mathematical questions. They had me interpret nuanced social scenarios. It was deeply humiliating to have to prove that my mind still belonged to me, but I channeled my quiet, burning anger into focus. I answered every question with the precision of the forensic accountant I used to be. 3 days later, I was back in Stuart's office. He was holding a thick, bound document. He slid it across the desk toward me. The results are conclusive. Philip Stuart said, his voice ringing with quiet satisfaction. You are not only in perfect cognitive health, but your executive function scores are in the 99th percentile for your age group. You have the mental acuity of a man 20 years younger. These evaluations are signed by a board-certified neurologist and a forensic psychiatrist. Diane Claim is dead in the water. We have the medical proof to completely obliterate her conservatorship petition. I felt a massive weight lift from my chest. I finally had a shield. I had the legal documentation to prove that my mind was sound. I could walk into court and watch Diane's malicious narrative fall apart before her very eyes. We have them, I said, feeling a surge of adrenaline. Let us file the counter petition. Let us break the hold on my accounts. Stuart held up a hand, stopping me instantly. His expression was not celebratory. It was grave. Not yet, Philip, he said, his voice dropping lower. Why, I asked, my frustration flaring. You just said we have the proof to destroy her case. We do, Stuart replied, leaning over the desk. But while you were proving your sanity, I was verifying your corporate findings. I ran a shadow trace on the routing numbers you provided for those dummy LLCs. I had to know exactly what we were dealing with before we lit the fuse. He opened a second file on his desk. This one was much thinner. Your stepson is greedy, Philip Stuart said quietly, but he is also incredibly sloppy. You told me the dummy corporations were registered in Wyoming and Delaware. You told me the routing numbers pointed to a regional credit union here in Ohio. I nodded, waiting for the inevitable complication. The bank here in Ohio is just a clearinghouse, Stuart explained, pointing to a heavily redacted printout. Justin and Monica are not keeping the $400,000 in domestic accounts. They are using the Ohio Credit Union to immediately bounce the funds to a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They are actively laundering the stolen money through international jurisdictions. The implications of his words slammed into me. I stared at the paper, trying to process the magnitude of the escalation. Philip Stuart said, his voice deadly serious. This is no longer a simple case of corporate embezzlement or elder abuse. When Justin and Monica transferred those funds across state lines to the Delaware and Wyoming LLCs, they committed wire fraud. When they bounced the money from Ohio to the Cayman Islands, they committed international money laundering. And when they forged your signature on those tax documents to justify the transfers, they committed federal tax evasion. He paused, letting the heavy silence fill the room. We cannot just walk into a local family court with this information, Philip. The moment we expose the financial fraud to break the conservatorship, the local authorities will have to investigate. And local authorities are not equipped to handle international money laundering. If they try, Justin will slip right through their fingers and that money will vanish forever. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, the victory of my medical evaluation, suddenly feeling very small. So what are you telling me, Stuart? I am telling you that this fraud has crossed state lines, Philip. It has crossed international borders. This is not a local dispute anymore. This is a massive multi-jurisdictional federal crime. We cannot take this to the local police. We have to take this to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The reality of the situation locked its jaws around me. If we went to the FBI, they would not just arrest Justin and Diane immediately. Federal investigations take time. They require flawless, undeniable evidence. They require a completely airtight case. Stuart looked me dead in the eye. I can get you a meeting with a federal prosecutor, Philip. I can secure you immunity for the forged tax documents. But if we bring the FBI into this, they are going to want a mountain of proof before they move on your family. They are going to need someone on the inside. They are going to need you. I looked at the medical evaluation, proving my sanity. I looked at the financial traces, proving my family betrayal. I was no longer fighting to save my bank account. I was standing on the edge of a massive federal sting operation. And to make it work, I was going to have to walk right back into the lion den. Stuart Campbell did not waste any single minute. 2 days after our meeting in his private office, we drove to a nondescript building in a corporate park just outside the city limits. There were no large government seals or intimidating signs painted on the glass doors. From the outside, it looked like a mid-level accounting firm or a regional insurance branch. But the men waiting for us inside a soundproof conference room were not accountants or insurance brokers. They were federal agents assigned to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Miller and Agent Davies sat across the heavy wooden table from us. They possessed a quiet, calculating energy that immediately commanded the room. Stuart handed them the thick binder containing the metadata, the forged tax documents, and the routing numbers tracing my stolen $400,000 from the regional credit union all the way to the Cayman Islands. I watched their eyes scan the pages in absolute silence. They did not show shock, anger, or surprise. They just processed the data with cold, mechanical precision. Agent Miller finally looked up and set the file down on the polished wood surface. He told me that my stepson had built an incredibly sophisticated laundering network. He explained that the federal government treats wire fraud and international money laundering with extreme severity. But he also told me a harsh truth about federal prosecutions. The federal government does not move fast. They do not kick down doors based on a single binder of evidence, no matter how compelling it looks. They build cases that are statistically impossible to defeat in court. They want every single conspirator mapped out, every dollar traced, and every piece of intent recorded on tape. If they moved right now, Justin could claim ignorance. He could easily claim the offshore accounts were set up by a rogue third-party consultant. Diane could claim she had no idea her son was a thief and use her pending medical conservatorship to paint me as a paranoid old man seeking revenge for imagined slights. Agent Davies leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and looked me directly in the eye. He told me that to make this case an absolute certainty, they needed an inside man. They needed a confidential source who could record conversations and gather real-time evidence of the conspiracy as it was happening. They needed someone who had unrestricted access to the house, to the corporate office, and to the perpetrators themselves. They needed me. Stuart placed a heavy hand on my arm and told me I did not have to do this. He said we could find another way to freeze the assets and drag them through civil court. But I knew there was no other way. If I backed out now, Justin would eventually realize I had discovered his massive theft. He would wipe the company servers completely clean and flee the country with my hard-earned money. Diane would trap me in a secure medical facility, pumping me full of medications until I simply faded away and died. I looked at the two federal agents and slowly nodded my head. I told them I was ready to do whatever it took to completely dismantle the cage my family had built for me. Agent Miller slid a thick stack of papers across the table. It was a formal informant agreement. By signing my name, I was officially binding myself to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I was waiving my right to act independently. I was agreeing to follow their strict protocols and rigid rules of engagement. I picked up the black pen and signed the documents without a single moment of hesitation. I felt a strange sense of finality as the pen glided across the thick paper. I was no longer a helpless victim trying to survive a brutal family betrayal. I was an active operational asset for the federal government. The agents led me into a smaller adjacent room to prepare me for the terrifying realities of covert surveillance. They did not hand me a complicated wire to tape to my chest. Modern federal surveillance equipment is terrifyingly subtle and practically invisible. Agent Davies handed me a new cell phone that looked exactly like the one I already owned, right down to the scratches on the case. He explained that the microphone could be activated remotely by their technical team, and that it would transmit high-definition audio directly to their secure servers. He then handed me a pair of reading glasses. The thick black frames were identical to the ones I wore every single day to read the morning newspaper. But hidden inside the tiny hinge of the right arm was a microscopic high-definition camera. The battery was stored inside the bridge of the frames. Agent Davies instructed me to wear the glasses whenever I interacted with Justin or Diane or Monica. He taught me how to angle my head naturally to keep them in frame without arousing any suspicion. They spent 3 exhausting hours running me through various conversational scenarios. They taught me how to extract verbal confessions without leading the witness into a legal trap. They told me to lean heavily into their false narrative of my cognitive decline. I had to ask confused, rambling questions that forced them to explain their illegal actions out loud on tape. The most critical instruction was also the hardest to accept. Agent Miller told me that no matter what Diane said to me, and no matter what Justin did, I could not break character for a single second. If they insulted me, I had to take it. If they threatened me, I had to cower and act afraid. If I showed even a tiny flash of my true intelligence, the entire operation would be immediately compromised. They would panic, and the case would fall apart before the ink on the indictments could dry. I had to suppress every natural instinct of self-preservation and fully inhabit the pathetic role of the broken old man. Stuart drove me back to my neighborhood late that afternoon. He dropped me off 2 blocks away so Diane would not see his expensive car from the living room window. I walked the rest of the way to my house feeling the heavy physical weight of the new reading glasses resting in my front shirt pocket. The federal government was fully backing my play. I had the unmatched power of the FBI waiting quietly in the shadows. But as I walked up my own paved driveway, the dark reality of my situation settled over me like a suffocating lead blanket. I was about to walk into a house completely occupied by greedy people who desperately wanted to destroy me. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen drifted down the long hallway. I could hear the sound of a television comedy playing from the living room. I walked into the kitchen and found Diane, Justin, and Monica sitting around the granite island, drinking expensive red wine and laughing together. The laughter stopped the exact moment I entered the room. Diane looked at me with cold, empty, calculating eyes. She demanded to know where I had been all day in a sharp tone that demanded immediate submission. I reached into my shirt pocket and put on my new reading glasses. A tiny silent vibration against my right temple let me know the federal recording equipment was officially active and transmitting. I let my shoulders slump forward. I softened my gaze and manufactured a look of deep, tired confusion. I told Diane I had just gone for a long walk and gotten a little lost on the way back home. Justin smirked and took a slow, arrogant sip of his wine. He told me I needed to be much more careful because wandering around alone was dangerous for a man in my rapidly deteriorating condition. Monica nodded in agreement and added that maybe it was time they started looking into safer assisted living arrangements for me. I stood there looking at the three people who were actively plotting to steal my entire life and lock me away in a facility. The microphone in my pocket and the camera on my face captured every single cruel word and every single arrogant smirk they made. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat down at the table with them. I smiled a weak, trembling smile and thanked them for caring so much about my well-being. The psychological toll of the moment was almost unbearable. I was sharing a home with absolute monsters, eating their food and sleeping under the exact same roof. I was completely surrounded by my worst enemies, but they had absolutely no idea that they had just invited a federal sting operation directly to their dinner table. I picked up my fork and began to eat, knowing the final act of this quiet war had officially begun. Living a double life inside your own home changes the very air you breathe. Every morning I woke up and put on the thick black reading glasses the federal agents had given me. The tiny hidden camera became my only true companion. For a week I shuffled through the hallways drinking my morning coffee and listening to the people I once loved plan my absolute destruction. It is a profound psychological torture to smile at a woman who is actively trying to erase your existence. I swallowed my pride and played the helpless old fool perfectly, but my flawless acting was creating a new problem. It was making them bold, and it was making them impatient. Thieves who steal small amounts can survive for years in the shadows. But Justin was not a professional criminal. He was a greedy amateur who had gotten a taste of real money, and now he wanted the entire vault. Siphoning off $400,000 through dummy corporations was no longer enough to satisfy him or his ambitious wife. They wanted the final massive payout. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my favorite armchair in the living room, staring blankly at a television program about deep-sea fishing. The volume was turned up loud enough to mask the sound of my own breathing. Diane, Justin, and Monica were gathered around the kitchen island, just a few feet behind me. They thought I was completely lost in the bright colors on the screen. The tiny camera in the hinge of my glasses was recording their every move. Justin pulled a sleek silver folder from his leather briefcase and slapped it down on the granite counter. He poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon and took a long celebratory sip. He leaned in close to his mother and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He told Diane that he had finally found a buyer for Reed Freight. A massive national shipping conglomerate wanted to purchase the physical assets of the company. They wanted our fleets, our warehouses, and our established trade routes. They were offering a buyout in the tens of millions. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my eyes fixed on the television screen. Justin was planning to liquidate my entire life work and sell it for parts. "There is just one problem," Justin whispered, tapping the silver folder. "The corporate bylaws require the primary shareholder to authorize a total asset liquidation. The buyers know Philip still holds the majority stake. They will not transfer a single dollar until they see his signature on the final contract." Diane smiled a cold, thin smile and took a sip of her own drink. She told her son not to worry about my signature. She reminded him that her emergency medical conservatorship was already in place. She explained that once the family court judge made the conservatorship permanent, she would possess complete legal authority over my estate. She would be able to sign the corporate liquidation papers on my behalf, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop her. Justin shook his head and ran a hand through his hair, looking stressed. He told his mother that the buyers were not willing to wait for a slow-moving local court to finalize the paperwork. The shipping conglomerate wanted to acquire the assets before the end of the fiscal quarter. Justin looked Diane dead in the eye and gave her a firm, unyielding deadline. He told her the deal had to be signed and closed by the 30th of the month. That was exactly 14 days away. Monica chimed in, her voice dripping with toxic annoyance. She complained that coming to the house and dealing with my constant presence was exhausting. She told Diane they could not just sit around and wait for the court date. If the judge wanted to drag his feet, the entire multi-million-dollar buyout would collapse. Monica insisted they needed to force the judge to act immediately. She said the only way to get a rubber stamp on a permanent conservatorship was to physically remove me from the house and lock me inside a secure medical facility. If the court saw that I was already living in a locked memory care unit, they would grant Diane total financial control without a second thought. Diane looked down at her wine glass and slowly nodded. She set the glass on the counter and turned to look at the back of my armchair. I let my head loll slightly to the side and allowed my mouth to hang open, pretending to be fast asleep. Diane told her son and daughter-in-law that Monica was absolutely right. She promised them that I would be out of the house and committed to a facility by the end of next week. She swore she would manufacture a medical crisis so severe and so undeniable that the state health authorities would have no choice but to take me away. She told Justin to tell the buyers that the signature would be ready by the 30th. The sheer cruelty of their casual conversation made me feel physically ill. They were dividing up my empire and planning my medical imprisonment while drinking bourbon in my own kitchen. I sat completely still, letting the hidden camera capture every single word of their terrifying conspiracy. The next morning, I walked to the neighborhood park and sat on a bench to discreetly pass the audio files to Agent Miller. We met in a quiet corner away from the walking paths. I handed him the encrypted data drive and watched his face as he listened to the recording. When the audio finished, Agent Miller looked at me with a grim, tight expression. He told me the timeline was brutally tight. The federal bureaucracy moves like a slow, heavy glacier. Building a bulletproof indictment takes months of careful maneuvering. But we no longer had months. We had exactly 14 days. If the FBI did not spring the trap before the 30th, Diane would successfully lock me inside a psychiatric ward. Justin would sell Reed Freight to the highest bidder. The offshore accounts would be flooded with millions of dollars, and my family would scatter to the wind before the federal government could even issue a subpoena. Agent Davies stood next to him, looking equally concerned. He warned me that the next few days were going to be the most dangerous part of the entire operation. Diane was desperate to get me out of the house. She was going to escalate her psychological warfare. She was going to push me to the breaking point, hoping I would snap and give her the violent or erratic behavior she needed to call the medical authorities. I looked at the two federal agents and told them I was not going to snap. I had built a massive logistics empire by staying calm under crushing pressure. I was not going to let a greedy stepson and a treacherous wife break my mind. I told them to get the federal warrants ready for the 30th. I would handle the rest. I walked back to my house knowing the final countdown had officially begun. The clock was ticking loud and fast, and I was about to walk straight into the fire. The very next morning, Diane launched her psychological war. She knew she had 14 days to break me completely. When you live with someone for 15 years, you learn their daily rhythms. You learn their habits and the small things that anchor them to reality. As a former accountant, I have always lived a life of strict order. I keep my things exactly where they belong. Diane knew my need for order was my primary anchor, and she set out to systematically destroy it. It started with my daily medication. I take a specific pill for my blood pressure every morning at 8. I have kept the orange plastic bottle on the exact same shelf in the master bathroom for a decade. On Thursday, I walked into the bathroom to take my pill. The shelf was completely empty. I felt a spike of genuine panic in my chest before my federal training kicked in. I walked out to the kitchen where Diane was sipping her morning tea. I asked her in a soft, trembling voice if she had seen my medicine. Diane looked at me with wide, innocent eyes. She told me I had already taken it. She said she watched me swallow the pill not 10 minutes ago. She asked me why my memory was slipping so badly. I stood there looking at her perfectly manicured face, knowing with absolute certainty that she had hidden the bottle to make me doubt my own mind. I lowered my head and apologized, saying I was just feeling a little lost today. The cruelty escalated by the hour. My reading glasses disappeared from my nightstand and miraculously turned up inside the kitchen oven. My favorite pair of walking shoes vanished from the hall closet and reappeared out on the back lawn, soaking wet from the automatic sprinklers. Every time I asked about a missing item, Diane would whip out her smartphone. She would hit the record button and capture my supposed confusion on video. She would speak to me in a sickeningly sweet voice, asking me why I was doing these crazy things to myself. "Philip, why did you put your shoes in the yard?" She would ask the camera, her voice dripping with fake tragedy. "Are you feeling confused again, sweetheart?" It is a terrifying experience to have your reality constantly undermined by the person you sleep next to. Even when you know it is a calculated lie, the gaslighting chips away at your soul. It makes you second-guess your own footsteps. But I did not snap. I remembered the strict instructions from the federal agents. I leaned heavily into the performance. She did not stop at moving my belongings. She actively worked to isolate me from the outside world. If the house phone rang, she would intercept it. I heard her telling my former colleagues and old friends that I was too confused to speak. She told them I was having bad days and that it was better if they did not visit. She was building a wall around my life brick by brick, ensuring that no one could verify my actual mental state. She even began tampering with my meals. Diane would serve me a plate of food, and then 10 minutes later she would casually walk by and take it away before I had taken more than 3 bites. When I would ask her where my dinner went, she would look at me with wide eyes and say I had already eaten the entire plate. She would point to the empty placemat and ask me if I was feeling hungry again so soon. It was a relentless physical and mental assault designed to make me feel weak, hungry, and totally dependent on her false reality. Whenever she pointed her camera at me, I made sure to stutter. I looked around the room with vacant, terrified eyes. I wrung my hands together and mumbled that I just could not remember anything anymore. I gave her exactly the pathetic, broken performance she needed for the family court judge. She needed a senile victim, and I gave her an award-winning show. On Sunday afternoon, she orchestrated her absolute masterpiece. I was sitting in my study wearing the thick black glasses the FBI had given me. The tiny hidden camera in the frame was silently recording everything. Diane walked into the room carrying a heavy stack of my most important financial documents. These were the personal tax records and bank statements I kept locked in my bottom desk drawer. She did not know I was awake. She thought I was dozing in my armchair with my eyes closed. I kept my eyes barely open, watching her through my eyelashes. Diane took the stack of private documents and deliberately scattered them all over the hardwood floor. She ripped a few of the pages in half. She threw some into the metal wastebasket. She took a cup of cold coffee from the desk and spilled it directly across a pile of my banking statements. Then she stepped back, surveyed the chaotic mess she had just created, and pulled her smartphone out of her pocket. She hit the record button. She walked over to my chair and shook my shoulder gently. I jerked awake, putting on a flawless mask of shock and fear. "Philip, look what you did," Diane said, her voice trembling perfectly for the camera. "Look at this massive mess. You tore apart your own financial records. You spilled coffee everywhere. You are destroying our important papers. Why are you doing this, Philip?" I looked at the ruined documents on the floor, and then up at her camera lens. I let my voice crack with manufactured grief. I told her I was sorry, and that my mind was just so jumbled up lately. I begged her to help me clean it up, telling her I was scared of what was happening to my brain. Diane stopped recording. The fake sympathy instantly vanished from her face. She looked down at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. She told me to clean up my own mess and walked out of the study, leaving me alone with the ruined papers. She had the perfect video. She had irrefutable visual proof that I was suffering from severe destructive dementia. She had exactly what she needed to hand to the judge to finalize my medical imprisonment before the 14-day deadline expired. But Diane was completely blind to her own fatal error. She did not realize that the thick black reading glasses perched on my nose had been recording the entire time. She got her damning video, but my hidden federal camera captured the full 5 minutes before she hit record. My lens recorded her walking into the room with clear, malicious intent. It recorded her intentionally scattering the documents across the floor. It recorded her pouring the coffee over the bank statements to stage the scene. She thought she was building an airtight case for a permanent conservatorship. She thought she was gathering the final nail for my coffin. But she had actually just handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation pristine high-definition footage of elder abuse, psychological torture, and evidence tampering. The trap was closing fast, and my treacherous wife was the one eagerly pulling the door shut. To completely break a human being, you do not need to use physical violence. You just need to strip away their dignity inch by agonizing inch. After the incident in the study, I knew I had to take my performance to the absolute limit. I could no longer just play the role of a forgetful senior. I had to become a hollow, empty shell of a man. I had to convince them that the brilliant founder of Reed Freight was entirely gone and that only a frightened, compliant child remained in his place. I stopped shaving every day. I allowed a patchy gray scruff to grow on my cheeks and chin, making me look neglected and deeply tired. I stopped choosing my own clothes. I would walk downstairs wearing mismatched socks and a sweater, buttoned completely wrong. Whenever Diane or Justin spoke to me, I would flinch slightly, pulling my shoulders up toward my ears as if I expected to be hit. I shuffled my feet, dragging my slippers across the hardwood floors. It is incredibly dangerous to pretend to be broken. If you hold the posture of a defeated man for long enough, your brain begins to believe you have actually surrendered. The psychological toll of the performance was immense. Every time I lowered my head and let them mock me, I felt a piece of my self-respect wither away. I was actively handing over my pride to the very people who were trying to destroy my life. The verbal abuse became a daily relentless heavy rain. Because they thought my mind was completely ruined, they stopped filtering their cruelty. We would be sitting at the dinner table, and Monica would openly talk about how my presence turned her stomach. She would look right at me and complain to Justin about the way I chewed my food or the way my hands shook when I held a glass of water. She talked about me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into her immaculate dining room and ruined the aesthetic. Justin was even worse. He stopped calling me Dad entirely. He started calling me by my first name, but he dragged out the syllables, speaking to me in a slow, mocking, sing-song voice. He would ask me if I needed him to cut my meat for me. He would ask if I remembered what year it was, laughing when I intentionally gave him the wrong answer. I sat there absorbing every insult, letting the venom soak into my skin. I forced tears to well up in my eyes. The tears were real, but they were not tears of confusion. They were tears of profound mourning for the boy I had raised who had turned into a monster. Diane watched these interactions with cold, silent approval. When the children were not around, she became a shadow that followed me through the house. Without her smartphone camera rolling, she did not bother playing the concerned caregiver. She would lean close to my ear while I sat in my armchair and whisper the most toxic, devastating things. She told me I was useless. She told me that nobody in the neighborhood respected me anymore. She whispered that my legacy was a joke, and that within a year no one would even remember my name. I listened to her cruel whispers through the thick black frames of my glasses. The hidden FBI camera captured the absolute malice on her face. The tiny microphone recorded every threat and every degrading insult. I found my strength in the knowledge that every terrible thing she said to me was adding another federal charge to her inevitable indictment. She thought she was breaking my spirit, but she was actually handing the federal prosecutors an irrefutable mountain of evidence for elder abuse and psychological coercion. The climax of my performance came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. We were just days away from their deadline to sell the company. I decided it was time to give them exactly what they needed to feel completely invincible. I walked into the living room where Justin and Diane were going over some paperwork. I purposely tripped over the edge of the expensive Persian rug and let myself collapse onto the floor. I did not try to get up. I stayed on my knees, wrapping my arms around my chest, and began to weep loudly. I begged them not to send me away. I sobbed and rocked back and forth, telling Diane I was so scared of the dark and that my head was filled with thick, heavy fog. I looked up at Justin with wide, terrified eyes and pleaded with him to protect me. I told him he was the smartest man I knew and that I trusted him to take care of everything. I surrendered completely and totally to their authority. Justin stood up from the sofa and looked down at me groveling on the floor. I watched his face closely through my tears. I expected to see at least a tiny flicker of guilt or hesitation, but there was absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated triumph. He looked at his mother and nodded slowly. He had won. The great Philip Reed was completely broken and kneeling at his feet. Diane did not help me up. She told me to go to my bedroom and stay there until I could stop crying like a pathetic child. I pulled myself up, trembling violently, and shuffled down the hallway. I closed my bedroom door and leaned against it, dropping the terrified facade instantly. My heart was pounding, but my mind was crystal clear. I had successfully convinced them that I was completely pliant and mentally destroyed. I had handed them the ultimate victory. But I also knew human nature. When a predator believes their prey is completely dead, they stop being cautious. They get greedy and they get sloppy, because they now believed my mind was entirely gone. Justin realized he did not have to wait for the slow-moving family court judge to grant the permanent conservatorship. He did not have to wait for Diane to gain legal signing authority. If I was as confused and terrified as I appeared to be, he could just put a pen in my hand and tell me to sign anything. He could make me authorize the corporate liquidation and confess to the missing funds right now without any legal hurdles. My flawless performance had achieved exactly what I needed it to. It made them arrogant. But it also prompted Justin to reach into his heavy leather briefcase and pull out the final fatal trap he had built for me. The endgame had arrived and Justin was walking right into the center of the crosshairs. The afternoon light was fading when Justin finally made his move. I was sitting in the living room staring at the television. The thick black reading glasses rested heavily on my nose. The hidden camera was silently capturing the entire room. Justin walked in carrying a thick stack of papers and a heavy silver pen. He sat down on the coffee table right in front of me, blocking my view of the screen. He smiled. It was the wide, reassuring smile of a loving son, but his eyes were completely dead. "Dad," he said, keeping his voice gentle and slow. "I need your help with some boring company paperwork. Just some routine insurance updates for the warehouse fleet. Nothing you need to worry your head about." I blinked slowly and looked down at the thick stack of legal documents. I let my hands tremble as I reached out to touch the top page. "Insurance?" I asked, letting my voice waver. "Is something wrong with the trucks, Justin?" "No, Dad. Everything is perfectly fine," he replied, patting my knee. "The insurance company just updated their policies. Since you are still technically the majority shareholder, they need your signature to keep the coverage active. If we do not get this signed today, the drivers cannot work tomorrow. You do not want the men to lose a day of pay, do you?" It was a brilliant manipulation. He knew I cared deeply about my employees. He was using my loyalty to blind me to the trap. I picked up the stack of papers and brought them close to my face. The hidden federal camera in my glasses scanned every single line of text. As my eyes tracked across the paragraphs, my blood turned to ice. These were not insurance updates. They were legally binding confessions. Justin had drafted a series of financial disclosures acknowledging that the founder of Reed Freight had personally authorized the transfer of $400,000 to 4 independent consulting firms. The documents stated that I took full responsibility for the financial health of the company and admitted to severe operational mismanagement. Buried at the very bottom of the stack was a sweeping power of attorney agreement, granting Justin the absolute right to liquidate the physical assets of the business to cover the supposed losses. He was handing me this murder weapon and asking me to pull the trigger on myself. If I signed these papers, I was legally confessing to the massive theft he and Monica had committed. I was giving him permission to sell my legacy, and I was providing him with the perfect defense when the federal auditors eventually arrived. He would just hand them these papers and say his poor, confused father had ruined the company before losing his mind entirely. I lowered the papers and looked at him. My heart was pounding, but I remembered the rigorous training the federal agents had given me. I needed him to explicitly state his lies on tape. "Justin," I murmured, squinting at the pages. "There are so many words here. My eyes are so tired. Are you absolutely sure this is just for the truck insurance?" Justin did not hesitate. "I promise, Dad. It is just basic liability coverage. I already read through every single line. You just need to sign at the bottom of the last 3 pages so I can get this sent over to the brokers. Please, Dad, do not make this complicated. My head is pounding, and I really need to get this done." He handed me the heavy silver pen. I took it in my shaking hand. I knew exactly what I was doing. By placing my signature on those fraudulent documents while under active federal surveillance, I was not signing away my life. I was handing the Federal Bureau of Investigation the final indisputable piece of evidence they needed for a conviction. I was sealing Justin inside a federal prison cell for coercion, wire fraud, and evidence tampering. I pressed the pen to the paper. I let my hand shake violently, making my signature look messy and uncoordinated. I signed the confession. I signed the asset liquidation authorization. I handed the stack of papers back to him, along with the silver pen. Justin snatched the documents from my hand. He looked at my messy signatures, and a look of profound, absolute relief washed over his face. He had done it. He had stolen my money, framed me for the crime, and secured the legal right to sell my empire. He stood up and patted my shoulder. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You did great. I will handle everything else from here. You just rest." He turned and walked toward the kitchen, clutching the papers like a winning lottery ticket. I sat back in my armchair. I had done it. I had survived the worst of it. The FBI had the recording of him lying to my face and coercing my signature. They had the evidence of his offshore accounts and his dummy corporations. All I had to do now was wait for the federal agents to finalize the warrants and kick the front door down. The trap was fully set. But then Diane walked into the living room. She passed Justin in the hallway and glanced at the signed papers in his hands. Justin gave her a triumphant nod and kept walking toward his office. Diane stepped into the living room and stood over my chair. I looked up at her, expecting to see the same smug satisfaction that Justin had just shown. Instead, I saw pure, unfiltered impatience. Diane looked at my unshaven face, my mismatched clothes, and my slumped posture. She did not look like a woman who had just won a fortune. She looked like a woman who was thoroughly disgusted by the presence of a sick animal in her pristine house. The long con was taking too much of a toll on her nerves. The fake sympathy she had to project for the neighbors was exhausting her. She crossed her arms and glared down at me. I offered her a weak, confused smile, playing the part of the broken husband. "I cannot do this anymore," she whispered, her voice shaking with sudden, intense rage. "I cannot watch you sit in this chair for another week while we wait for a judge to look at paperwork. I cannot listen to you shuffle down the hallway. I want you out of my house." I blinked, letting a tear roll down my cheek. "Diane, what is wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice small and frightened. "Did I do something bad again?" She leaned down so close I could smell the expensive wine on her breath. "I am done waiting for the legal system, Philip. I am done playing the sad, exhausted wife for the neighborhood. I am accelerating the plan tonight. By the time the sun comes up tomorrow, you will be locked in a state facility, and I will be free." She turned on her heel and marched up the stairs. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my veins. The carefully controlled federal operation was suddenly spinning, completely out of control. I had expected her to take Justin's signed documents to the family court in the morning. I had expected the FBI to intercept them there, but Diane was not going to wait for the morning. Her hubris and her disgust had pushed her over the edge. She was about to bypass the legal system entirely and take a devastating shortcut that none of us had anticipated. I sat alone in the living room, listening to the sound of her heavy footsteps on the floorboards above me, knowing that whatever she was planning to do tonight was going to bring the police to my doorstep long before the federal agents were ready to protect me. The silence in the living room was deafening. I sat completely still, listening to Diane's heavy, purposeful footsteps directly above me. She was pacing the length of the master bedroom, her impatience vibrating through the floorboards. She had just told me she was accelerating the timeline, that she was done waiting for the slow wheels of family court to grant her the conservatorship. But how exactly does an angry, desperate woman bypass the entire legal system in a single night? I was about to find out, and it would be the most dangerous 48 hours of my life. I remained in my armchair, staring blankly ahead, maintaining the facade of a broken old man, while every nerve in my body screamed on high alert. The hidden camera in my glasses was still recording, capturing the tense, silent atmosphere of the house. I knew I had to stay in character. If Diane came downstairs and saw me standing tall, looking sharp and alert, she would panic. I had to let her execute whatever disastrous plan she was hatching upstairs. An hour later, the heavy thud of footsteps began descending the staircase. Not one set of footsteps, but two. Diane and Justin were walking down together, their voices hushed, but carrying a chaotic, desperate energy. I let my head loll back, half closing my eyes, feigning a deep, troubled sleep. Through my eyelashes, I watched them enter the living room. Justin was carrying a heavy black duffel bag. He looked nervous, sweating slightly, clutching the bag tightly against his side. Diane, however, looked terrifyingly calm. Her face was set in a mask of cold, resolute determination. Justin walked over to the built-in bookshelves near my study, specifically the section where I kept a small, heavy steel safe bolted to the floor. It was a safe I rarely used, meant for old family photos and a few emergency documents. Diane had the combination. She had always had the combination. I watched, holding my breath, as Diane knelt down and swiftly spun the dial. The heavy metal door clicked open. Justin unzipped the black duffel bag and pulled out 3 thick, heavy external hard drives. These were not standard consumer drives. They were high-capacity enterprise-level storage units. He handed them to Diane, who carefully, almost reverently, placed them inside my personal safe. She shut the door and spun the dial, locking them inside. What are those? I thought, my mind racing. Why would Justin bring corporate hard drives to the house, and why would Diane lock them in my personal safe? Then it hit me with the force of a freight train. The $400,000, the fake invoices, the dummy LLCs. Justin had downloaded all the incriminating data from the Reed Freight servers. He had transferred the entire digital footprint of his massive theft onto those physical hard drives, and now Diane was planting them directly in my possession. They were not just going to declare me senile. They were going to frame me for the entire federal crime, physically tying the stolen data to my personal safe. If the police found those drives here locked away with my personal documents, there would be no question of my guilt. I would look like a criminal mastermind who was desperately trying to hide the evidence of his own crumbling mind. Diane stood up, dusting off her knees. She looked at Justin and nodded sharply. "It is done," she whispered. "Now we make the call." My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Make the call. She was going to call the police right now. She was not going to wait for the morning. She was staging a massive, immediate crisis to force the authorities to remove me from the house tonight. Diane pulled her smartphone from her pocket. She took a deep breath, visibly composing herself. She closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, the cold, calculating woman vanished. In her place was a terrified, hysterical wife. It was a terrifying transformation to witness. She hit the dial button and brought the phone to her ear. I listened, paralyzed, as she executed the final devastating phase of her plan. "Hello, yes, please, I need help," Diane cried into the phone, her voice shaking with perfectly manufactured panic. "My husband, Philip Reed, he is not well. He has been acting so strangely, and I just found something terrible." She paused, listening to the dispatcher on the other end. I stayed completely still, my hidden camera capturing every single tear, every single lie. "I found stolen computer drives in his safe," she sobbed, her voice rising in pitch. "I think he has been stealing money from his own company. He is confused, he is erratic, and he is getting aggressive. I am terrified of him. Please, you have to send someone right away. I do not feel safe in my own home." She gave the dispatcher our address, her voice breaking in all the right places. She begged them to hurry, claiming I was waking up and looking angry. It was a masterful, flawless performance. She was handing the local police a packaged narrative, a dangerous, mentally unstable man who had just been caught red-handed committing massive corporate fraud. She hung up the phone and wiped the fake tears from her cheeks. The hysteria vanished instantly, replaced by that same cold, triumphant smile. She looked down at me, still pretending to sleep in the armchair. "Sleep well, Philip," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "This is your last night in a comfortable bed." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, Justin following closely behind. I sat alone in the dim living room, the reality of the situation settling over me like a suffocating blanket. The police were coming. Not the federal agents I had been working with, but local patrol officers responding to a domestic crisis and a reported corporate crime. The carefully controlled federal operation was now officially a chaotic, unpredictable mess. Diane had bypassed the slow-moving court system and used the blunt instrument of the local police to force my immediate removal. I knew I could not run. If I tried to leave the house, Diane would tell the police I was a fleeing suspect, a confused old man running from his crimes. If I tried to explain the federal sting operation to the local officers, I would sound exactly like the paranoid, delusional man Diane claimed I was. I had no choice but to sit there and wait for the raid. I closed my eyes, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every second brought the police closer to my door. I ran through the plan in my head over and over again. I had to trust that Stuart Campbell and the FBI had eyes on the situation. I had to trust that the federal shield I had built would hold against this unexpected local assault. The silence of the house was shattered by the distant rising wail of police sirens. They grew louder, fast, and aggressive, tearing through the quiet suburban night. The flashing red and blue lights began to strobe across the living room walls, casting long, frantic shadows. The sirens abruptly cut off, replaced by the sound of heavy tires screeching to a halt in my driveway. Car doors slammed. Heavy-booted footsteps pounded up the front walkway. I heard Diane rush to the front door, throwing it open with a dramatic, breathless sob. "Oh, thank God you are here," she cried. "He is in the living room. Please be careful. He is very confused." The heavy footsteps moved quickly down the hallway. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing slow and measured, bracing myself for the impact. The living room flooded with blinding flashlight beams. Loud, authoritative voices filled the space. "Philip Reed. Keep your hands where we can see them. Do not move." I opened my eyes, blinking against the harsh light. I played the part perfectly. I looked around, bewildered, frightened, exactly as a confused, innocent old man would. What is happening?" I stammered, raising my trembling hands. Before I could say another word, rough hands grabbed my arms, hauling me roughly out of the armchair. The cold steel of handcuffs ratcheted tightly around my wrists. I was being dragged out of my own home, the trap snapping shut exactly as Diane had planned. I was being marched toward the flashing lights, stepping right back into the very beginning of this nightmare. The heavy metal door of the interrogation room clicked shut. Detective Larson and I were completely alone. The suffocating tension that had filled the small concrete room as moments before was entirely gone. In its place was a heavy, stunned silence. Larson stared at me, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had just walked into a dark room and flipped a light switch, only to discover he was standing in the middle of a live minefield. He looked down at the thick manila folder resting on the metal table. He looked back up at me. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice barely a whisper. What the hell is going on here? I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the tight muscles in my back finally begin to relax. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and let the persona of the terrified, confused old man melt away completely. I looked him dead in the eye with the calm, calculated precision of a man who had just spent 6 months orchestrating a masterpiece. "I told you, Detective. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been waiting for my signal. Larson swallowed hard. He reached out with a trembling hand and slowly opened the file again, as if he expected the pages to physically bite him. He flipped past the first page, past the massive bold letters of my federal informant designation, and started reading the detailed executive summary that Stuart Campbell had prepared. When Diane and Justin planted those stolen hard drives in my safe and called the local police, they thought they were executing a flawless shortcut. They thought they were bypassing the slow family court system to have me immediately removed from the house in handcuffs. What they did not know was that my attorney, Stuart Campbell, had placed a digital tripwire on the local emergency dispatch system the moment I signed my informant agreement. The second Diane dialed 911 and gave our address, Stuart received an automated alert. He knew exactly what she was doing. He immediately contacted Agent Miller and Agent Davies. They moved with terrifying federal efficiency. They could not stop the local police from raiding my house. That would have tipped off Diane and Justin that a larger operation was in play. They had to let the local officers arrest me. They had to let Diane play her part and hand over her meticulously forged evidence. But the file that Diane handed to the patrol officers on my front lawn never made it to Detective Larson's desk. When the squad car carrying me pulled into the station, Sally Port, Stuart Campbell, and the two federal agents were already waiting in the precinct captain's office. They intercepted the arresting officers. They took possession of Diane's fake file, locking it away as pristine evidence of evidence tampering and filing a false police report. In its place, Stuart handed Detective Larson Captain a completely different manila folder, a folder containing the explosive truth. The captain had instructed Larson to walk into the interrogation room, read the file, and follow the federal instructions inside. Larson's eyes darted back and forth across the pages, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was reading the detailed timeline of the massive $400,000 embezzlement. He was reading the routing numbers pointing to the Cayman Islands. He was reading the transcripts of the audio recordings capturing Diane and Justin planning to destroy my mind and steal my company. He flipped to the last section of the file. He let out a low, sharp breath. "Jesus Christ," he murmured, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his eyes. They paid a known FBI informant $50,000 to forge medical documents. They were planning to fake a psychiatric evaluation to steal your estate. "Yes, Detective," I said, keeping my voice steady. "They were planning to erase me, and they thought they could use your badge and your department to do their dirty work." The realization hit Larson hard. He saw exactly how Diane had played him. She had used the local police force as a blunt instrument to execute her own private, hostile takeover. She had made a mockery of his department, sending heavily armed officers to drag a 70-year-old man out of his bed based entirely on a malicious, calculated lie. The shock on Larson's face slowly morphed into a dark, simmering anger. "Nobody uses my department like a private hit squad," he growled, closing the file with a sharp, definitive slap. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing with a new, intense focus. "Mr. Reed, the file says the feds have active warrants ready to be executed. Why am I sitting in here with you while your family is back at your house thinking they just got away with the crime of the century?" I smiled a thin, cold smile. "Because, Detective, we are not just going to arrest them. We are going to let them celebrate their victory. We are going to let them feel completely untouchable. And then we are going to bring their entire world crashing down around them." I explained the final phase of the operation. If the police simply drove back to my house right now and kicked the door down, Justin would immediately claim he had no idea what was on those hard drives. Diane would play the victim again, saying she was just a terrified wife trying to protect herself. We needed them to drop their guard completely. We needed them to openly confess their victory while the federal wire in my glasses was transmitting live. I told Larson that I needed to walk back through my own front door. I needed to walk in unannounced and uncuffed. I needed to stand in my living room and look them in the eyes while they were actively celebrating my destruction. The shock of seeing me free and lucid would break their composure. They would panic. They would scramble to explain themselves, and in doing so, they would incriminate themselves beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt. Larson listened to this plan, his anger sharpening into a professional tactical edge. He understood the psychology of the sting. He knew that the most devastating confessions do not happen in interrogation rooms. They happen when arrogant criminals suddenly realize the floor has vanished beneath their feet. He stood up from the metal table and grabbed the federal file. He looked at me with a grim, determined nod. "All right, Mr. Reed. Let us go crash a party." He walked over to the heavy metal door and opened it. He stepped out into the busy squad room and signaled for the 2 patrol officers who had arrested me. They hurried over looking tense and expectant. Larson did not yell. He did not explain the massive federal conspiracy. He simply gave them a direct, undeniable order. "Get a cruiser ready out front," he commanded, his voice carrying clearly across the bullpen. "We are taking Mr. Reed home." The officers looked confused, but they did not question a direct order from a senior detective. I stood up from the metal chair, smoothing the wrinkles out of my pajama shirt. I walked out of the interrogation room, my head held high. I was no longer a prisoner. I was the architect of my own justice, and I was going home to collect. I walked out of the precinct through the heavy glass double doors. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the scent of damp asphalt and impending justice. I did not walk toward the black and white patrol cars parked in the front lot. Instead, Detective Larson guided me toward the shadowy edge of the building, where a massive matte black sport utility vehicle sat idling in the dark. The tinted windows rolled down just an inch, revealing the sharp, unreadable eyes of Agent Miller. Larson opened the heavy armored door for me, and I slid into the passenger seat. Agent Davies was behind the wheel, his hands resting lightly on the leather steering wheel. The interior of the vehicle smelled of black coffee and tactical gear. There was no radio chatter. There was no small talk. There was only the cold, mechanical precision of a federal strike team preparing to execute a flawless operation. Stuart Campbell. My attorney sat in the very back row, his face illuminated by the soft blue glow of a tablet. He gave me a single silent nod. The doors locked with a heavy metallic thud, sealing us inside. Davies put the vehicle in drive, and we pulled out of the parking lot, gliding onto the empty suburban streets. We did not use sirens. We did not use flashing lights. We moved through the sleeping city like a ghost. I watched the familiar neighborhoods roll past my window. These were the same streets I had driven down for decades. I had built my life here. I had paid for the manicured lawns and the quiet cul-de-sacs with my own blood and sweat. And now I was returning to my home not as a broken husband or a defeated father, but as the lead informant in a major federal raid. I looked down at my hands resting on my knees. They were no longer trembling. The act was completely over. I thought about Diane. I thought about the 15 years I had spent sleeping next to a woman who was actively calculating the exact dollar value of my death. I thought about the hundreds of Sunday dinners, the shared holidays, the quiet mornings drinking coffee on the patio. Every single memory was now tainted by the sick, heavy realization that she had been playing a long, treacherous game. She had traded her soul for a payout she would never live to spend. The emotional toll of the last 6 months began to lift from my shoulders. The suffocating weight of playing the senile, helpless old man evaporated into the dark interior of the federal vehicle. I felt my spine straighten. I felt the sharp, analytical mind of the forensic accountant fully returning to the surface. I was Philip Reed again. Agent Miller leaned forward from the back seat, resting his arms on the center console. He handed me the thick black reading glasses. The tiny green light on the inside hinge was already blinking, indicating the federal wire was hot and transmitting. Miller told me to put them on. He explained the tactical layout of the breach in a low, calm voice. The local police cruisers were staging 2 blocks away, maintaining a tight perimeter to ensure no one slipped out the back door. The federal agents would stack up on the front porch, completely out of sight, waiting for my cue. Miller looked me dead in the eye and gave me my final strict instructions. He told me to unlock the front door and walk inside exactly as I normally would. He told me to walk straight into the living room and let them see me. He said they needed to experience the absolute shock of my unexpected return. They needed to drop their guard completely and start talking out of sheer panic. Miller told me to keep them talking for exactly 60 seconds. 60 seconds to let them incriminate themselves on the live federal wire one last time. After 1 minute, the agents would breach the door and bring the heavy hammer of the federal government crashing down. We turned onto my street. The neighborhood was entirely dark. The porch lights of my neighbors were turned off. The panic and chaos from the 2 a.m. raid had settled back into a deep suburban sleep. But my house was completely different. As Davies killed the headlights and eased the heavy vehicle to a silent stop 3 houses down, I could see the warm golden light spilling out of my living room windows, illuminating the front lawn. Stuart tapped the screen of his tablet and leaned forward. He had tapped into the hidden audio transmitters we had planted in the house weeks ago. He turned up the volume so we could all hear what was happening inside before we moved in. The crisp, clear sound of a popping cork echoed through the dark cabin of the vehicle. We heard the clinking of expensive crystal glasses. We heard the unmistakable sound of Monica laughing, a loud, piercing sound of pure, unfiltered victory. Justin's voice came through the speakers, thick with arrogance and expensive champagne. He offered a loud toast to the easiest $400,000 they ever made. His voice carried clearly across the quiet living room, celebrating their flawless heist. He offered another toast to the immediate liquidation of Reed Freight. Diane chimed in, her voice dripping with cruel, profound relief. She told them they needed to drink fast because they still had actual work to do. She ordered them to bring the rest of the physical ledger pages to the fireplace. Through the federal audio feed, we heard the heavy metallic grinding of a high-capacity paper shredder roaring to life. We heard the sharp crackle of thick paper being tossed into the open flames of the gas fireplace. They were not just celebrating my imprisonment. They were actively destroying the very last remnants of the physical evidence while they drank my champagne in my house. They believed the local police had taken their bait completely. They believed they had won the war and were now happily burning the battlefield to the very ground. Miller reached down and unclipped the heavy safety holster on his hip. He looked at Davies and gave a silent, sharp nod. The doors of the vehicle opened with a quiet, synchronized click. The damp night air rushed into the cabin. We stepped out onto the cold pavement, moving like silent shadows toward the brightly lit house. I walked up my own driveway, feeling the heavy brass key pressing into my palm. My treacherous family was inside, drinking to my absolute destruction and burning the physical evidence of their massive federal crimes. They thought they had successfully locked the door on my life forever. But they were about to realize that I was the one holding the master key. I turned the heavy brass key in the lock of my own front door. The mechanism clicked with a sharp metallic snap that felt louder than a gunshot in the quiet suburban night. I pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer. Behind me, Agent Miller and Agent Davies moved like silent shadows, stepping into the house with their hands resting casually on their tactical belts. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit jacket and took a deep breath of the air in my home. It smelled of expensive champagne and the melting plastic of a heavy-duty paper shredder. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps firm and steady, completely abandoning the slow, pathetic shuffle I had practiced for the last 6 months. I turned the corner and stepped into the sunken living room. The scene before me was like a still life painting of pure, unadulterated greed. Diane was pouring a second glass of sparkling wine, laughing at a joke I could not hear. Justin was feeding a thick stack of printed ledgers into the roaring fire of the gas hearth. Monica was leaning against the granite kitchen island, scrolling through her phone with a smug, satisfied grin. Diane was the first to see me. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sharp crash made Justin spin around. He froze instantly. The pages he was holding slipped from his grip and scattered across the expensive Persian rug. "Philip, what are you doing here?" Diane stammered, her voice barely a squeak. "How did you get back?" She looked behind me and saw the two federal agents standing tall and imposing in their dark windbreakers. The remaining color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow ghost. "You are supposed to be in a holding cell," Justin managed to say, taking a stumbling step back from the fireplace. "You are supposed to be confused. You are supposed to be locked away." I looked at the three of them, allowing a cold, terrifying smile to spread across my face. I reached up and slowly took off my thick black reading glasses, folding them neatly and placing them in my breast pocket. I stood at my full height, letting the commanding presence I used to run a logistics empire flood back into my posture. "I am not confused, Justin," I said. My voice was no longer a trembling whisper. It was a booming, resonant command that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "I am not tired. I am not senile. And I am certainly not the pathetic old fool you all thought you were burying tonight." Diane opened her mouth to speak, to spin another desperate web of lies, but I cut her off instantly. I told her not to say a single word. I told her she had done enough talking for the last 6 months, and I had recorded absolutely every second of it. "You thought you were so incredibly clever, Justin." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step into the center of the room. "You thought a 70-year-old logistics manager would never understand the digital locks you put on the company servers. You forgot that I spent 15 years as a corporate forensic auditor hunting thieves much smarter than you. I found the $400,000 you siphoned out of Reed Freight on the very first night you locked me out of the system. I traced the fake invoices from Apex Freight Solutions and Horizon Logistics Partners. I tracked the stolen money from the dummy corporations in Wyoming and Delaware straight to Monica and her regional credit union right here in Ohio." Monica let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She backed away from the kitchen island, her eyes darting frantically toward the front door. Justin backed up until his shoulders hit the stone mantel of the fireplace. "But you did not stop there," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous level. "You had to bounce the stolen cash to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to hide it. And then you made your fatal mistake. You forged my electronic signature on federal tax documents to justify the missing funds. You tried to frame me for a massive federal crime. Did you really think you could orchestrate an international money laundering scheme and leave me holding the bag without severe consequences?" Diane began to shake uncontrollably. She dropped to her knees on the ruined carpet, ignoring the shattered glass from her champagne flute. "Philip, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic sob. "We can explain everything. It was a misunderstanding. We were just trying to protect the assets for the family." I looked down at her, feeling nothing but absolute disgust. I reminded her that she had planted stolen corporate hard drives in my personal safe just hours ago. She had called the local police to raid this house and drag me out in my pajamas. She thought she handed the local detective a file containing my forged confessions. I told her that my attorney had intercepted the local police long before they ever reached the station. The file Detective Larson opened did not contain her fabricated lies. It contained my full federal informant dossier. I tapped the pocket where my glasses rested. I told them I had been wearing a live federal wire every single day I shuffled around this house. I revealed that I had recorded Diane plotting to switch my blood pressure medications and isolate me from my friends. I recorded Justin handing me fake insurance documents to sign away my company. I recorded everything they said tonight before I walked out the door. I told them the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been listening to every cruel, arrogant word they spoke and analyzing every single financial transfer they made. "You are not walking away with my company," I told them, savoring the absolute destruction of their manufactured reality. "You are not walking away with my wealth, and you are certainly not putting me in a nursing home. Let me tell you exactly what you are walking away with tonight. You are facing federal indictments for wire fraud, international money laundering, tax evasion, evidence tampering, and elder abuse. You are looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary." I watched them process the magnitude of their failure. For 15 years, I had provided for them. I paid off their debts, I gave them jobs, I offered them a life of comfort and security. And in return, they had calculated the exact dollar value of my freedom. They had laughed at my supposed cognitive decline. They had mocked my age and my trusting nature. But the old man they thought they were manipulating was the one who had just methodically dismantled their entire future. Diane collapsed entirely, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically. Her perfect manicured life was disintegrating before her eyes. Justin looked around the room like a trapped, terrified animal searching for an exit that did not exist. His arrogance had completely vanished, leaving only the coward I always knew he was. Monica was paralyzed, staring at the federal agents standing silently by the door, tears streaming silently down her pale cheeks. The arrogant empire they had tried to build on my supposed grave had completely evaporated in less than 5 minutes. They had spent half a year treating me like an invisible, useless burden. They had meticulously planned my financial and psychological ruin. They thought they were the predators, and I was just the easy prey. I looked at the ashes of the documents burning in the fireplace and then back at my treacherous family. I told them the celebration was officially over. I turned to Agent Miller and gave him a single nod. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Diane weeping on the floor. I stood tall in my own living room, reclaiming the space, the dignity, and the life they had tried to steal from me. The trap they had built with their own greed had finally snapped shut, and they were locked securely inside. Agent Miller stepped forward, his presence dominating the ruined atmosphere of my living room. He did not yell or brandish a weapon. He spoke with the quiet, crushing authority of the federal government. He looked at Justin first. He stated that Justin was under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit extortion. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Justin did not fight back. The arrogance that had defined him for a decade simply evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified boy. He slowly raised his hands, and Agent Davies stepped up behind him, securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic click echoed sharply across the room, sealing his fate. Monica began to hyperventilate. She backed away toward the kitchen island, shaking her head violently from side to side. She pleaded with the agents, telling them she was just following the instructions of her husband. She claimed she had no idea the money was stolen. But Agent Miller did not even blink. He calmly recited the exact metadata timestamps from her personal computer, proving she had personally authored the fraudulent invoices. He told her she was under arrest for her direct participation in the financial conspiracy. She collapsed against the granite counter, weeping uncontrollably as another agent stepped forward to place her in restraints. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her perfect life shattered into dust. Then Agent Miller turned his cold gaze toward Diane. My wife was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the shattered glass of her champagne flute. She looked up at the federal agents, her face twisted in a mask of absolute horror. She tried to speak, to formulate another lie, but the words choked in her throat. She looked at me, her eyes begging for a lifeline that no longer existed. She crawled across the expensive rug, ignoring the shards of crystal that bit into her knees. She stopped at my feet and looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "Philip, please," she begged, her voice a desperate, pathetic whisper. "You have to stop this. You know I love you. We are husband and wife. I was just trying to protect our future. You cannot let them take me away. I am your family." I looked down at the woman who had shared my bed for 15 years. I looked at the woman who had methodically planned my mental destruction, who had hidden my medication, who had staged a local police raid at 2 a.m. to have me dragged out of my home in pajamas. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the profound satisfaction of a man who has watched a predator walk directly into a trap. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I slowly pulled out my smartphone. I held it up in front of my face, pointing the camera lens directly at her tear-stained, terrified face. I pressed the record button. The screen glowed, capturing her absolute humiliation in high definition. I looked at her through the screen of my phone, and I spoke with a voice completely devoid of emotion. "I cannot hide your crimes anymore, Diane," I said, repeating the exact words she had screamed for her own live broadcast hours earlier. "I have to protect my company, I have to do the right thing. The realization of what I was doing hit her like a physical blow. She realized I was perfectly mirroring her ultimate betrayal. She realized that her own cruel tactics were being used to finalize her destruction. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure defeat. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire universe collapse into ash. Agent Miller stepped forward and grasped her by the arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. He read her rights in a flat, monotone voice as he snapped the handcuffs around her wrists. She did not struggle. She simply hung her head, sobbing brokenly as the reality of her impending federal prison sentence washed over her. The agents marched them toward the front door. I followed closely behind, watching them take their final steps inside my home. The federal vehicles were parked in the driveway, their red and blue lights flashing silently in the dark suburban night. My neighbors had stepped out onto their lawns once again, but this time they were not watching a confused old man being carted away. They were watching the arrogant, greedy architects of a massive criminal conspiracy being hauled off to federal prison. Justin was shoved into the back of a dark sport utility vehicle, his head bowed in absolute shame. Monica followed, her cries of panic muffled by the heavy armored doors shutting behind her. Finally, the agents guided Diane down the front steps. She looked back at me one last time, her face illuminated by the flashing police lights. There was no defiance left in her eyes. There was only the terrifying realization that she had vastly underestimated the quiet logistics manager she had married. She was loaded into the back of the federal vehicle, and the heavy doors locked with a definitive thud, sealing her inside a cage she had built with her own 2 hands. I stood on the front porch and watched the taillights of the federal convoy disappear down the quiet suburban street. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance, leaving my neighborhood bathed in the peaceful amber glow of the street lamps. The heavy silence of the night settled around me, but it was no longer a suffocating silence. It was the silence of a battlefield after the smoke has finally cleared and the victory has been firmly secured. I took a deep, slow breath of the cool night air. The oppressive, toxic weight that had occupied my home for over a decade was finally gone. I turned around and walked back inside my house, closing the heavy wooden door behind me. I walked into the living room and looked at the embers dying in the fireplace. The ashes of the forged documents were still glowing softly in the dark. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my empire. The night was over, and my new life was just beginning. 6 months have passed since that long, dramatic night in Ohio. I am no longer living in that large, empty house in the suburbs. The memories attached to those walls were too heavily stained by the betrayals of the past. Today, I am sitting on the wide wooden porch of a custom-built cabin nestled deep in the quiet pine forests of upstate New York. The morning sun is reflecting off the pristine surface of a private lake, and the only sound I hear is the gentle rustling of the wind through the tall trees. It is a profound, absolute peace that I have not known for most of my adult life. The legal fallout from the federal operation was swift and entirely devastating for the people who tried to destroy me. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not leave a single stone unturned. The mountain of evidence I helped them gather was so overwhelming that the legal defense team for Justin and Monica immediately advised them to accept a plea deal. They tried to bargain. They tried to blame each other, but the federal prosecutors offered no mercy. Last month, a federal judge sentenced both Justin and Monica to 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary. They were convicted of wire fraud, international money laundering, and conspiracy to commit extortion. They will spend the best years of their lives locked inside tiny concrete cells, stripped of their fancy cars, their expensive clothes, and their manufactured arrogance. Diane refused to take a plea deal. Her overwhelming hubris simply would not allow her to admit defeat. She truly believed she could charm her way out of a federal indictment. But when the government froze all of her assets pending the criminal investigation, she suddenly found herself completely destitute. She could no longer afford the elite, high-priced defense attorneys she desperately needed. She is currently sitting in a county holding facility, awaiting a massive federal trial, relying on an overworked public defender who has already told her the case is entirely hopeless. She has lost everything: her freedom, her reputation, and the lavish lifestyle she was willing to commit murder to protect. She is totally and completely alone, isolated in a cage built entirely from her own malicious greed. As for my life, I took swift and decisive action the very morning after the arrests. I walked into the corporate headquarters of Reed Freight, not as a fading retiree, but as the undisputed master of my empire. I immediately fired every single executive and manager who had been complicit in the illegal schemes of my stepson. I hired a team of independent auditors to scrub the company servers clean, ensuring that every stolen dollar was meticulously accounted for and reported to the authorities. Once the company was entirely stabilized, I reached out to the national shipping conglomerate that Justin had originally courted. I sat down at the negotiating table and handled the corporate buyout myself. Without the desperate greed of Justin undermining the valuation, I was able to negotiate a final sale price that was significantly higher than their initial offer. I sold the physical assets, the warehouse fleets, and the established trade routes for a massive clean profit. I secured generous severance packages for my loyal employees, ensuring they were protected during the corporate transition. Then I took my immense fortune and simply walked away. I left the chaotic corporate world behind, forever choosing instead to embrace the quiet, serene retirement I had actually earned. I pour myself a fresh cup of dark black coffee and lean back in my heavy wooden rocking chair, looking out over the calm waters of the lake. I think about the terrifying, chaotic journey of the last year. I think about the profound psychological torture of playing the helpless, confused old man. I think about the agonizing discipline it took to swallow my pride and absorb the daily insults from people who believed I was too weak to fight back. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it taught me the most valuable lesson of my entire life. True power does not require screaming. It does not require dramatic confrontations or throwing punches in the dark. True power is found in absolute patience. It is found in the discipline of silence. When you realize that toxic, arrogant people are actively plotting your destruction, your first instinct is to react, to defend yourself, and to fight back immediately. But reacting only shows them your hand. Reacting gives them the opportunity to change their strategy and hide their crimes. I learned that the most devastating counterattack is simply stepping out of the way. If you remain quiet and observe carefully, you will find that greedy, malicious people are incredibly eager to orchestrate their own downfall. Their arrogance blinds them to the traps they are setting for themselves. They believe that kindness is a weakness and that silence is a symptom of defeat. They never suspect that the quiet person sitting in the corner is actually a meticulous architect, carefully documenting every single lie they tell. I take a slow sip of my warm coffee, feeling the gentle morning sun on my face. I am 70 years old, and I have never felt more alive, more secure, or more powerful. I have successfully protected my legacy and secured my future. I have removed the poison from my life with surgical precision, leaving behind only the clean, fresh air of my secluded lakeside retreat. I leave you with this final simple truth. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never assume that a silent man is a defeated man. Sometimes true strength is simply handing an arrogant predator the shovel and patiently waiting for them to dig a hole so deep they can never climb back out. The ultimate lesson drawn from Philip's ordeal is the profound power of strategic silence. When faced with deep betrayal from those closest to you, the natural human instinct is to react with explosive anger and immediate confrontation. However, raw emotion is exactly what manipulators rely on to paint you as unstable, reactive, and irrational. By mastering your ego and playing the exact role your enemies expect, you turn their own arrogance into a weapon against them. True strength lies not in shouting the loudest, but in quietly stepping aside and allowing toxic, greedy individuals to confidently build the very traps that will eventually secure their own downfall. If Philip's triumphant story of quiet justice inspired you, hit that like button, subscribe for more incredible life stories, and let us know in the comments how you would have handled such a devastating family betrayal.